The log came down wrong. Clara Whitmore felt it before she heard it, a deep, sickening shift in the weight, the rope burning through her palms like a lit fuse. The timber swung. Her feet left the ground, and for one breathless second, the whole world tilted sideways, and she thought, this is how it ends. Alone, unmourned, buried under the very thing you were trying to build. She hit the dirt hard. The log missed her by 6 inches. And from up on the ridge, a man she had never spoken to stood very still and watched her get back up. If you are new here, welcome. I want you to subscribe to this channel. Turn on the notification bell and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get into it. The summer of 1886 did not arrive gently in Harrow Creek, Wyoming. It came in like a landlord, hard, dry, impatient, with no sympathy for anyone who wasn't already standing on solid ground. The grass in the lower fields went yellow by June. The creek that gave the town its name dropped to a trickle by July. And the people of Harrow Creek, the ones who had been there long enough to think they owned something, watched the heat roll in off the mountains and decided, as small-town people often do, that whatever suffered in that heat probably deserved to. Clara Whitmore had been in Harrow Creek for 11 days when she understood that no one was going to help her. Not the men at the feed store who went quiet when she walked in. Not the women on the church steps who let their eyes travel from her face to her waist and back again with the particular slowness that said everything they didn't bother to put into words. Not the land agent, Mr. Aldous Fitch, who had smiled too wide when he handed her the deed to 40 acres 3 miles outside of town, and who had said with the cheerful confidence of a man who fully expects to be proven right, "You sure about this, Miss Whitmore? That land's been sitting empty for a reason." Clara had taken the deed. She had folded it once, precisely, and tucked it into the front pocket of her coat. And she had said, "Thank you for your concern," in the voice her mother had taught her, the voice that meant, "I heard you, and I am done listening." She had been using that voice a great deal lately. The land itself was 40 acres of hard-packed soil, scattered pine and silence. The cabin the previous owner had started was barely a shell, 4 low walls of rough-cut timber. No roof, 1 window frame with no glass, a dirt floor that turned to mud when the afternoon thunderstorms came rolling off the mountains. It was, by any reasonable measure, not much. Clara Whitmore loved it with the immediate, irrational ferocity of someone who had not had a place to love in a very long time. She had her father's tools. She had 2 mules she'd bought in Cheyenne, a stack of timber she'd had hauled out from town at a price that had nearly cleaned out the last of her savings, and a notebook filled with her own careful sketches, measurements, angles, load calculations that she'd spent 3 months teaching herself from a borrowed copy of a builder's manual she'd found in a church library in Nebraska. She did not have a husband. She did not have brothers. She did not have a single person in Harrow Creek who had offered her anything other than doubt dressed up as concern. That was fine. She knew how to work with what she had. The first week, she learned the weight of pine. There is a particular kind of education that no book prepares you for, the kind that lives in your shoulders, in the cramped ache of your hands at the end of a day, in the way your body learns, slowly and without mercy, the exact limits of what it can carry. Clara learned that a 12-foot log weighs more than a promise and less than a broken one. She learned that ropes lie to you, they feel secure right up until the moment they don't. She learned that blisters burst and calluses form, and that the second week is always harder than the first, because by then your muscles have figured out what you're asking of them and have decided to register their formal objections. She did not stop. The people of Harrow Creek noticed. They noticed the way that people in small towns always notice things they haven't been invited to from a distance. With commentary. "Saw that Whitmore girl out on the plot again," said Roy Dunham, to no one in particular. One morning at the feed store counter. Roy was 43, and had the kind of voice that always sounded like it was telling you something you should already know. "Hauling timber by herself, with those mules," said Clem Baxter, who ran the feed store and had the good sense to mostly stay out of other people's business. Though not quite enough sense to stop Roy Dunham from conducting business in his store. "She's going to hurt herself," Roy said. "Woman her size. Working like that in this heat. It ain't proper." He said her size the way people say things they want you to hear without being the kind of person who says them plainly. Clem didn't answer. "Somebody ought to talk to her," Roy said. "You could talk to her," Clem said. Roy did not go talk to her. Clara was aware of the talking. She had grown up being talked about. There is a specific skill that develops in girls who are never quite the right shape for the room they're standing in, a kind of peripheral awareness. A way of knowing you are being discussed without needing to hear the words. She had developed that skill early. By the time she was 14, she could feel a conversation change around her from 20 feet away. She had spent years trying to make herself smaller, quieter, less. She had spent years smiling at the wrong moments, apologizing for taking up space, wearing dark colors because someone had once told her they were slimming, as though she were a problem that needed solving. She had stopped doing all of that 6 months ago, when her father died and left her 40 acres in Wyoming and a letter that said, in his careful school teacher's handwriting, "Clara, my girl, stop waiting for permission, the land is yours. Go build something." She was building something. She just needed to get the east wall up first. It was the log on the 16th day that nearly ended everything. She had rigged a pulley system her own design, based on the builder's manual, and 3 days of adjustments to lift the heavier timbers into place. It worked. It had worked 6 times before that afternoon. She had checked the rope that morning, running it through her hands, inch by inch, the way her father had taught her to check everything that you are about to put your weight behind. What she hadn't accounted for was the knot. Not her knot, the knot in the wood itself. A hidden fault deep in the grain of the timber, invisible until the rope pulled taut and the stress found it, and the log twisted on the line like a living thing that had just decided it didn't want to go where she was sending it. She felt it in the rope first. That sick, sudden lurch, the rope going slack for a half second, and then pulling hard in the wrong direction. She had time to think no, and then the log swung and the pulley came apart and 14 feet of pine came down. She threw herself backward. The log hit the ground where she had been standing. The impact shook the earth under her feet. Dust and wood chips flew up and she hit the half-built wall behind her with enough force to knock the breath clean out of her body, and she went down, hands hitting the dirt, knees following, the world spinning in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. For a moment she just knelt there, breathing. Her palms were bleeding. She could feel it before she looked the hot, immediate sting of rope burn ripping into skin. She looked down and her hands were a mess of red and raw pink, and she thought, very clearly, don't cry, not yet. Check if you're broken first. She wasn't broken. She ran her hands up her arms, checked her ribs with careful fingers, rolled her shoulders. Bruise shaken, not broken. She looked at the log lying in the dirt 3 feet away from where she'd been standing. 6 inches, maybe less. She sat down in the dirt and she put her bleeding hands on her knees and she breathed for a while. That was when she heard him. She didn't hear his horse until it was close. He rode quiet. Or maybe she'd been too focused on breathing to notice sooner. Either way, when she looked up, there was a man standing at the edge of what would eventually be her east wall, holding his hat in his hands and looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately place. Not pity. Pity had a certain softness to it. A head tilt, a pursing of lips. This wasn't that. He was tall, the kind of tall that you noticed even when a man was sitting still. Broad through the shoulders, in the way that came from actual work rather than show. Dark hair going gray at the temples, jaw shadowed with a few days' worth of beard. He looked like the kind of man the mountains made. Or maybe the kind the mountains kept worn down to the essential parts. Nothing left over. He was looking at her the way you look at something that surprises you. Something that makes you reconsider what you thought you knew. Clara got to her feet. She did not wipe the blood from her hands because she didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fuss over it. "I'm all right," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I can see that," he said. "I didn't ask for help. I know that too." She waited for the rest of it. "But you clearly need it, little lady. You shouldn't be out here alone. Why don't you let me?" He didn't say any of it. He put his hat back on, tilted the brim against the afternoon sun, and looked at the pulley wreckage on the ground. "You're not slipped," he said. There was a fault in the wood, that too. He looked at the rigging. "You designed that yourself?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, studying it. "It's a good design," he said. "Wrong rope. You need hemp for that load, not cotton. Cotton stretches when it's been sitting in heat." Clara stared at him. "Who are you?" "Ethan Callahan." He didn't offer a hand. He just looked at her. "I've got the place up on the North Ridge." "Been watching you work." "Watching me work," she repeated. There was an edge in her voice. She heard it. She didn't remove it. "Trying to figure out if you knew what you were doing," he said. There was no apology in it, just a plain statement of fact. Delivered the way men who live alone deliver most things. Without any particular concern for how it lands. Clara felt the familiar sting of it. The way people announced their doubts about her, like they were doing her a favor by being honest. She had heard variations of this sentence her entire life. Trying to figure out if you could handle it. Trying to figure out if you'd last. "Trying to figure out if a woman like you, Anne," she said. "And you know what you're doing," he said. "Mostly." She blinked. That was not what she had expected him to say. "The design is solid," he said again. Looking at the rigging. "You've got the load angles right. You've got the wall spacing right. Most men I know would have set those corner posts 2 inches short and thought they were fine. You didn't." He looked at her. "But you need the right rope. And you need somebody to spot the line when you're lifting something that heavy. Not because you can't do it, because it takes 2 people. That's just physics." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "I don't have 2 people," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I came down." His name, she learned over the next hour, was Ethan Callahan. And he had been on the North Ridge for 4 years. Since before the town of Harrow Creek had incorporated enough to have an opinion about much of anything. He had a small cattle operation, 23 head. A good border collie named Scout, and a barn that was better built than most houses in the county. He had been married once. His wife had died in the winter of 1882. The second winter after they'd come out from Missouri. From a fever that the doctor in Laramie had given a long name to and then been unable to stop. He had a daughter. She was 9. She lived with his wife's sister in Cheyenne. Because he had made the decision, the hardest decision of his life. He said it flat, like a man reciting a fact he has recited many times, so that it stops feeling like anything that a child needed more than a man living alone on a ridge. He said all of this in the same tone he used to explain the difference between hemp rope and cotton rope. Matter of fact, unhurried, as though the information belonged to someone else and he was simply reporting it. Clara listened. She didn't fill the silences with "I'm so sorry" or "how awful" or any of the things people usually said. She just listened, and when he was done she said, "What's her name?" He looked at her like she'd said something unexpected. "May," he said. "Does she visit?" "Twice a year, since summer." "Is she coming this summer?" Something moved across his face, not quite a smile. Not quite pain. Something between the two. "In 3 weeks," he said. "Good," Clara said. He looked at her again with that same expression she'd seen when he first rode up. The one she still couldn't name. "You want to tell me why you're building a cabin alone in the middle of nowhere?" he said. "Or is that not my business?" "It's not your business," Clara said. "But I'll tell you anyway. She picked up the end of the ruined rope and started cutting it loose from the pulley frame. My father left me this land. He died in January. My mother died 2 years before that. I have no siblings. I have a small amount of money that gets smaller every week I'm not living on this property and not working it. She cut through a bad section of rope and let it drop. I am 21 years old. I have never built a house before. I am building one anyway because I have nowhere else to go and nothing else to do, and because my father believed I could do it. She looked up. That's why. Ethan Callahan was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. All right, he said again. You want to get that east wall up before dark or not? He stayed for 3 hours. He didn't take over. That was the thing she noticed first. And noticed again, and turned over in her mind later when she was trying to understand him. He didn't walk in and start directing things. He picked up the secondary line and held it where she told him to hold it. When she said pull, he pulled. When she said wait, he waited. When she made a decision about placement he disagreed with, he said, "You want to think about that?" And when she said why, he explained. And when she considered and decided he was right, she adjusted. And when she decided he was wrong, she said. And he let it stand. 3 times. That was how many times he let her be wrong without pushing back a second time. She noted that too. The east wall went up in the time they had left in the afternoon. It wasn't perfect. One timber sat about a 1/4 inch out of true, and she knew she'd have to shim it later, but it was up. It was standing. It was the most wall she'd put up in a single afternoon since she'd started. When they were done, Ethan untied the rope ends and coiled the good sections. Clara sat on the low edge of the south wall and wrapped her palms in the clean strips she'd torn from an old flour sack. The bleeding had slowed. It would scab over by morning. Same time tomorrow, Ethan said. She looked up. You're coming back? If you want the north wall up before the week's out, you're going to need the rope and an extra set of hands. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on a fence post. I've got morning chores. I can be down here by noon. Clara looked at him steadily. There was something she needed to know, and she was going to ask it plainly. Because she had learned that plainness was more efficient than dancing around things. Why, she said. He settled the hat on his head. Why what? Why are you helping me? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. She kept her voice even. People in this town have been waiting for me to fail since the day I got here. You've been watching me work for 16 days, so I want to know what you want. He looked at her for a long moment. The light was going orange and long behind him, the way it does in Wyoming when the day is almost done and everything goes gold for a little while before the dark. I don't want anything, he said. I watched you for 16 days because I couldn't figure out if you were going to make it. He paused. I still don't know if you're going to make it, but I know you're not going to stop trying. And I don't see a lot of that anymore. He picked up his horse's reins. See you at noon, Miss Whitmore. He rode back up the ridge without looking back. Clara sat on the wall she'd built and looked at her wrapped hands and listened to the sound of the evening birds coming in and thought about a man who had watched her for 16 days and come down not because she had fallen, but because she had gotten back up. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He didn't announce it as a commitment. He didn't explain it as charity. He simply arrived at noon, tied his horse to the fence post at the property line, always the same post. She noticed and walked in and picked up whatever needed picking up. They worked. They didn't talk much. When they did talk, it was about the workload-bearing ratios, the behavior of different wood and heat, the way the Wyoming wind moved through the valley, and what that meant for the roof pitch she was planning. On the 4th day, he brought hemp rope. He set it down without a word. She looked at it, then at him. How much, she said. Nothing, Ethan. I had extra, he said. It was a lie, and they both knew it. She let it stand. On the 6th day, he brought lunch. 2 tin plates, biscuits wrapped in cloth, salt, coffee in a battered pot. He set it on the south wall and sat down and started eating and didn't explain it and didn't invite her. just sat there eating like this was a thing they did. And after a moment, Clara sat down too and ate, and they sat together in the heat of the noon hour and didn't talk. And it was the most companionable silence she had experienced since her father died. On the 8th day, a woman from town came out to the property. Her name was Dottie Marsh. She was maybe 50, broad-faced, with the kind of careful pleasantness that sits right on top of something much less pleasant. She arrived in a buggy, stepping down with the deliberate grace of someone who wants to be seen arriving correctly. And she looked around the property with the bright, busy eyes of a woman who is cataloging everything she sees for later use. "Miss Whitmore," she said. You have been busy, Mrs. Marsh," Clara said. She kept working. She did not stop working. "I heard you had some help." Dottie's eyes went to Ethan, who had his back to them and was doing exactly what Ethan always did when something came up that wasn't the work, which was continue doing the work. "Ethan Callahan." She said his name with a specific weight. "I'm surprised you could get him down off that ridge. He don't usually well. He's been very private since Eleanor passed. We worry about him." "He's fine," Clara said. "I can see that." Dottie smiled. "It's just you know how people talk." She lowered her voice to a register that was somehow more carrying than her regular voice. "A young woman, living out here alone, with a man coming and going," she paused. "It doesn't look proper." Clara set down the level she'd been using. She straightened up. She turned and looked at Dottie Marsh with the full, level attention of someone who is about to say something and mean every word of it. "Mrs. Marsh," she said, "this is my property. That man has come to help me work on it. He arrives at noon and leaves before dark, and we have done nothing I would not do in a public square." She picked the level back up. "If the people of this town have nothing better to occupy them than the business of a woman they've never spoken to, then I feel deeply sorry for how quiet their own lives must be. Good afternoon." Dottie Marsh blinked. She opened her mouth. She closed it again. She got back in her buggy and left. Clara went back to work. After a moment, she heard Ethan's voice from across the frame. "You always talk to people like that," he said. "Only when they deserve it," she said. Another pause. "My wife used to do that," he said. It was quiet. It wasn't sad exactly. It was the tone of someone touching a scar to see if it still hurts. Said exactly what she meant. Didn't apologize for it. Clara didn't answer for a moment. Then she said, "She sounds like she was something." We said. They went back to work. What Ethan didn't say, what he wouldn't say for a long time yet, was what Dottie Marsh's visit had done to him. Not her words. Her words hadn't landed anywhere. But the look on Clara's face when she'd heard them, the way she'd gone completely still for half a second before she'd answered. The way something had moved behind her eyes that she'd put away very deliberately before she spoke, that had landed somewhere it shouldn't have. He knew that look. He had worn that look. It was the look of someone who has heard this particular brand of dismissal so many times that they have learned to process it without letting anyone see how much it costs. He had not expected to recognize it on someone else's face. He had not expected to feel, for the first time in 4 years, the specific anger of watching someone you not care about. He wasn't ready to say that word, not even in the privacy of his own head, someone you respect be diminished by people who weren't worth her attention. He went home that evening and stood in his kitchen and told himself it was just common decency. A neighbor helping a neighbor. He'd have done the same for anyone. He knew he was lying. He knew it the way you know things you don't want to know suddenly. Completely, and with no available exit. On the 12th day of their arrangement, Roy Dunham came out to the property. He didn't come alone. He brought 2 men from town, Pete Lassiter, who owned the saloon, and a younger man Clara didn't know, broad-shouldered and slow-smiling, in a way that reminded her of something she wanted to stay in front of. They arrived mid-afternoon, when the heat was at its worst, and Clara was on the half-finished roof frame with a hammer, and Ethan was below, steadying a crossbeam. "Callahan," Roy Dunham said. By way of greeting, he didn't look at Clara. Ethan turned. He didn't say anything. He was very still in the way that Clara had come to understand, meant he was paying close attention. "Just stopping by," Roy said. "Heard you'd been helping out here." He looked around the property with the casual thoroughness of a man doing an appraisal. "Coming along it is," Ethan said. "Miss Whitmore." Roy finally looked up at her. He had the satisfied expression of a man who has decided how a story is going to end. "You know the Miller plot's been empty 5 years for a reason. Hard land. Bad water access. Most people, they'd look at this and say maybe this is more than you bargained for." Clara kept her hammer in her hand. "Most people say a lot of things," she said. Roy smiled like she'd made a small joke. "We just don't want to see you get in over your head." A young lady on her own, his eyes traveled over her. The same slow inventory that Dottie Marsh's had, the same specific kind of looking that said you are being measured and found lacking. "This is hard country, you understand." "I understand hard country fine." "Mr. Dunham," Clara said. "I grew up as it may." Roy looked at Ethan. "People are talking, Ethan. You know how it is. Town's not that big. A man in your position, a man with a daughter, you want to be careful about your associations." The word landed the way he meant it to land. Not as a warning, as a weapon. The silence afterward was very particular. Clara felt it the way you feel a temperature change suddenly, and in your whole body. She kept her face still. She kept her hand steady on the hammer. She did not look at Ethan, because she understood what Roy Dunham was doing, and she understood why. And the part she was most afraid of was the part where it worked. Where Ethan did the math quietly and reasonably, and decided that the help wasn't worth the cost, and came back tomorrow with a polite explanation and a gentle withdrawal. And she would be alone again, and it would be fine. It would be completely fine. She had been alone before, and she would be alone again, Roy, Ethan said. His voice was the same as it always was, steady, unhurried. "Roy," he said again, "I'm going to need you to leave now." Roy blinked. You've said what you came to say." Ethan set down the beam he'd been holding and turned to face Roy fully. He wasn't aggressive about it. He didn't step forward. Didn't raise his voice. He just turned and gave Roy Dunham his complete, unsmiling attention. "I've heard it. Now I need you to get back in your wagon and leave this property." Roy looked at his two companions. The younger man had stopped smiling. "You want to think about what you're doing here," Roy said. His voice had gone careful in the way that voices go careful when they realize they may have miscalculated. "I've thought about it," Ethan said. "I need you to leave." Roy left. The three of them drove off the property in silence, and Clara sat on the roof frame and held her hammer and watched them go. When they were out of sight, she looked down at Ethan, who had picked up the beam again and was waiting for her to get back to work. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," he said. "It's going to make things worse. Probably." He lifted the beam to the mark she'd chalked on the post. "You going to stand there, or are you going to nail this?" She nailed it. They didn't talk about Roy Dunham again that afternoon. But when Ethan rode out at the end of the day the same time he always left, the same unhurried way he always left, he paused at the property line and looked back. Miss Whitmore. She was still on the roof, checking the pitch of the last beam in the fading light. "Callahan," she said. "Whatever they say about you in that town," he said, "they're wrong." She looked at him across the distance. The light was going long in gold again, the way it always did at the end of these days. "I know," she said. "Good," he said. "Just wanted to make sure you knew I knew it too." He rode up the ridge. Clara sat on the roof of the house. She was building her house. Every log of it, every nail, every aching inch of it, and she pressed her palms flat against the warm timber, and she felt the solid, real unmistakable weight of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not hope exactly, not yet, but something close to it. Something that had the same shape. And below her, the frame of the walls stood in the cooling evening air. And above her the Wyoming stars were coming out one by one. And somewhere up on the north ridge a light had come on in a window, the same window she'd seen lit night after night, since the first day she'd come to this land. She had never thought to wonder who lived there. She thought about it now. 3 weeks. That was how long it took for the people of Harrow Creek to decide that Clara Whitmore was a problem worth solving. Not ignoring, they had tried ignoring her in the beginning, and ignoring hadn't worked because she kept showing up, kept hauling timber, kept swinging a hammer at hours when respectable women were inside doing respectable things. And not welcoming, because that had never been on the table. What they settled on, in the quiet consensus that small towns reach without ever holding a meeting about it, was management. The sense that someone needed to step in and redirect this situation before it became something they'd all have to live with permanently. Ethan knew the feeling. He had been managed by this town before. After Eleanor died, there had been a period, maybe 8 months, maybe a year, when he couldn't go into town without someone taking his elbow and steering him toward their particular solution to the problem of Ethan Callahan. The Hendersons had a niece. The Coopers had a daughter recently widowed. Pastor Greer had thoughts on the healing power of community, delivered at length and with great feeling every time Ethan was unfortunate enough to be within earshot. He had moved through it the way he moved through most things, quietly, without engagement, until people eventually understood that he was not a problem looking for their solution. He understood, watching Clara, that she did not yet have that particular armor. She was still in the phase where the management hurt, where she heard what people said and carried it home with her and set it down in the dark and turned it over, looking for the piece of it that she could use to fix something about herself. He recognized it because he had done the same thing once. He had stopped when he realized the only thing wrong with him was that he hadn't died when Eleanor had. And no amount of fixing was going to resolve that to anyone's satisfaction. He wondered when Clara would figure out that the only thing wrong with her was the same kind of thing, that she existed in a way that made other people uncomfortable. And that was their problem, not hers. He figured she was close. He figured that was what Roy Dunham's visit had been about, a final test. The town's last real attempt to push her off that land before the house went up far enough to be a permanent fact. She had passed it without flinching. He was still thinking about that 3 days later when May arrived. His daughter came off the stage from Cheyenne on a Tuesday morning, and Ethan was waiting at the depot with his hat in his hands and a feeling in his chest that he never got used to and never tried, to the specific, helpless fullness of seeing your child after months of absence. The way she was always somehow both exactly the same and startlingly different from the picture he carried of her. May was 9 years old and looked like her mother around the eyes, and like him around the jaw, and like nobody else on earth in the particular way she had of looking at everything around her with the steady, cataloging attention of someone taking inventory. She stepped off the stage, saw him, and walked to him with the controlled dignity of a 9-year-old who has decided that running is undignified, and then, when she got close enough, abandoned the dignity entirely and wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her face into his shirt. He held her. He didn't say anything, he just held on. "Hi, Papa," she said, into his shirt. "Hi, Maybird," he said. After a moment she pulled back and looked up at him. "You look tired." "I've been working." "Mrs. Aldrich says you work too much and don't talk enough, Mrs. Aldrich is right about the second part," he said. May studied him the way she always studied him, like she was reading something he wasn't saying out loud. "Are you sad?" "No," he said. And then, because she would know if he was lying, "Not right now." She considered this. Then she picked up her bag and said, "All right, let's go home. I want to see Scout." They rode back up the ridge, and Scout met them at the fence gate with the full-body joy of a dog who has been waiting for exactly this reunion. And May dropped to her knees in the dust and let the dog knock her sideways and didn't care at all. And Ethan stood and watched and felt the specific grief and gratitude of a man who knows he does not deserve what he has been given. He had not planned to take May to the property. It happened on the 3rd day of her visit, when she came to find him in the barn, where he was sorting rope, good hemp rope, which he'd bought 2 spools of and had been using at Clara's, and she looked at the rope and then at him with those steady eyes and said, "Where do you go every afternoon?" "I've been helping a neighbor," he said. "Which neighbor?" "Miss Whitmore. She's building a cabin on the old Miller plot." May was quiet for a moment. Working through this. By herself. Why was she doing it by herself? Because she didn't have anybody else. May sat down on a hay bale and looked at him. "And now she has you?" The word arrangement did not quite cover what Clara and Ethan had. But he didn't have a better word for it, so he just said, "I've been going down around noon to help with the lifting. Can I come?" He thought about it. He thought about what Clara would say, and then I thought about the fact that Clara would probably say exactly what she thought, which was what she always did, and that was either going to work or it wasn't. "If you stay out of the way," he said. May nodded seriously. "I'm good at staying out of the way." This was true. She was, possibly, the best 9-year-old he had ever met at reading a situation and positioning herself in it correctly. Clara was on the north wall when they arrived, measuring a beam with the careful focus she brought to everything that required accuracy. Which was everything. She heard the horses and looked down. And when she saw May, something moved through her expression, not surprise. Exactly, more like recalibration. She came down from the wall. "Miss Whitmore," Ethan said. "This is my daughter May." "May, this is Miss Whitmore." May looked at Clara with that inventory look of hers, serious, thorough, unhurried. "You're building this yourself?" May said. "Mostly," Clara said. "Your father's been helping. He said he helps with the lifting because it takes 2 people. That's physics." Clara glanced at Ethan. He kept face neutral. "That's right," Clara said. "What's that part going to be?" May pointed at the east wall, where Clara had begun framing in the window, the main room window. "I want it facing east so I get the morning light." May nodded. "Processing this, our window faces north," she said. "Papa says north light is better for reading." "He's right," Clara said. "But I'm not much of a reader. I like mornings." May looked at her again, that long, serious look. Then she said, "Do you need someone to hand you nails?" Clara looked at her. Then she looked at Ethan. He gave a small shrug that meant, "Don't look at me." "I could use someone to hand me nails," Clara said. May picked up the nail bucket without further discussion and followed Clara back to the east wall. And Ethan stood at the fence post and watched his daughter fall into easy step beside a woman she had met 40 seconds ago and felt something shift very quietly inside his chest. May stayed for the whole afternoon. She handed nails. She held the end of the measuring tape when Clara needed 2 points checked. She asked questions not the way children usually asked questions, with the rapid-fire scatter of curiosity without direction, but with the focused, one-at-a-time precision of someone who actually wanted to know the answers. Why this beam weight and not a lighter one? Why the window frame needed the extra brace? Why Clara had placed the front door where she had rather than facing the road? "Because the road is where trouble comes from," Clara said. "Driving a nail with 3 clean strokes, the door faces the mountains. That's where the good things come from, in my experience." May considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "What good things come from mountains?" "Clean water," Clara said. "Quiet, and the occasional man with good rope." She said it without looking at Ethan. He heard it from across the frame and felt the side of his mouth pull despite himself. May looked between them with an expression that was far too knowing for 9 years old. She did not say anything. She handed Clara another nail. It was on the walk back to where the horses were tied that May said it. She had been quiet for a few minutes, the thinking kind of quiet, the kind Ethan had learned to give space to. They were almost to the fence post when she said, without looking up, "She's not what I expected." Ethan looked at her. "What did you expect?" "I don't know." May scuffed her boot in the dirt. "The ladies in Cheyenne, when they help people, they make a lot of noise about it." Like they want everyone to know. She thought about this. Miss Whitmore doesn't make a lot of noise. No, Ethan said. She doesn't. She's very sure of things. Even when she's scared. May looked up at him. I think she's scared sometimes. She just doesn't let it stop her. Ethan looked at his daughter. She was looking back at him with Eleanor's eyes and his jaw, and nobody else's particular way of seeing straight through to the thing you weren't saying. That's right, he said. May nodded, satisfied. Then she walked to her horse and mounted up with the easy competence of a child who has been riding since before she could read. And they rode back up the ridge together in the long golden light. And Ethan did not say anything else, and neither did May. And that was perfectly fine. The next morning, Roy Dunham came to see Ethan. He came early before 7. Before Ethan had finished with the morning chores, which Ethan took as a deliberate choice. There is a specific kind of dominance move that involves showing up at a man's house before he's had time to fully armor himself against the day. Ethan recognized it and filed it away. Roy sat on the porch rail with his coffee cup like it was his porch. And he watched Ethan come out of the barn and didn't bother to stand up or tip his hat. Heard you brought your girl down to the Whitmore place yesterday, Roy said. I did, Ethan said. He went to the pump and washed his hands and didn't look at Roy. That's, Roy paused, selecting his words with the care of a man who wants to sound reasonable. That's an interesting choice, Ethan. Bringing a child into that situation. What situation is that? Roy? You know what situation. Roy set down his coffee cup. People are talking. They're talking about what it looks like. A man spending every afternoon out there. And now bringing his daughter. It looks like what? Ethan dried his hands and looked at Roy directly. He kept his plainly, Roy. Roy met his eyes. It looks like you're forming an attachment that isn't appropriate. Given the circumstances. Ethan was quiet for a moment. You're going to need to be more specific about which circumstances you mean, he said. Whether you mean her age or her situation, or the way she looks. Because I want to know exactly what you're objecting to before I respond to it. Roy had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. But he pushed through it the way men like Roy always did by finding a different angle. I'm saying the town has concerns. About her. About what she's doing out there. About where she really came from and why she came to Harrow Creek specifically, and not some other place. Ethan went still. It was a different kind of still than the one he used when he was paying attention to something. It was the kind of still that came just before something that was being held down finally got out. What are you suggesting, he said. Roy spread his hands. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying there are questions. About that land. About the deed Fitch drew up. About whether everything is as clean and simple as a young lady from nowhere showing up alone with money and a deed. He looked at Ethan. You've been spending a lot of time with her. You haven't asked her any of those questions. No, Ethan said. Why not? Because they're not my questions to ask, Ethan said. She came here with a legal deed. She's breaking legal ground. She's not bothering anyone. He paused. Unless being a woman who doesn't ask permission counts as bothering people these days. Roy's jaw went tight. Ethan. Ethan picked up his work gloves from the porch rail. You came here to tell me to stop helping her. I'm telling you I'm not going to. If you've got concerns about her land deed, take them to the land office. That's what it's there for. He put on the gloves. And next time you want to talk to me before 7 in the morning. Bring something worth talking about. Roy left. Ethan stood on the porch for a moment after the sound of hooves faded. The question had landed somewhere, though. Not in the way Roy intended, not as a seed of doubt about Clara herself. But as a seed of something else. Something Ethan hadn't let himself think about yet. The question of why she was here, why this land. Why she had come to Harrow Creek specifically, and not some other place with cheaper land and fewer opinions. He pushed it down. He picked up his tools. He went back to the barn. But it was there now. Quiet and small, but there. Clara had known for 2 weeks that she was being followed. Not followed the way a person follows another person, not with footsteps and shadows. Followed the other way, the way that information follows you when someone is working to assemble it. Questions asked in town she hadn't been present for. Answered by people who had no reason to know the answers, but repeated them anyway. The land agent, Fitch, who had been too friendly at the beginning and had gone carefully neutral in a way that felt more dangerous than unfriendly. The letter she'd gotten 3 days ago, postmarked from Laramie. With no return address, that said only, "We know where you are. Clara, give it back and this ends." She had put the letter in the false bottom of her father's toolbox, the one place she kept the things that mattered. The deed, the documents, the evidence, and she had gone back to work. Because going back to work was the only thing she knew how to do when the walls started moving in. She hadn't told Ethan. She hadn't told him, because telling him meant explaining everything. And explaining everything meant trusting him with something she had not trusted anyone with since her father died. And she was not ready to do that. She was not sure she would ever be ready to do that. Trust, in her experience, was something people accepted with both hands and then dropped when it became inconvenient. But the letter changed the math, because the people who had sent it knew she was in Harrow Creek, which meant they were either here already or they were coming. And being on a half-built property 3 miles outside of town, alone with a toolbox full of documents that could destroy a very powerful man's carefully constructed lie that was no longer just a personal problem. It was a ticking clock. She was measuring for the interior door frame when she heard the wagon coming up the road. And she knew from the sound 2 horses, heavier load, moving faster than delivery pace, that it was not the feed store. She kept measuring. The wagon pulled up and 2 men got out. Not from Harrow Creek, she'd seen everyone from Harrow Creek by now. Their faces were familiar the way faces become familiar when you are perpetually aware of who might be watching you. These were strangers. One heavyset, with a badge on his vest that he wore like an afterthought. One younger, narrower, with the kind of careful stillness that said this was not his first difficult conversation. "Miss Clara Whitmore," the heavy-set one said. She set down her measuring tape. "That's me, Deputy Marshal Cole, out of Laramie." He tipped his hat, the gesture emptied of courtesy by everything else about him. "We've had a complaint filed regarding the deed to this property." Clara felt the cold move through her from the center outward. She kept her hands still at her sides. "What kind of complaint?" she said. "A Mr. Gerald Whitmore, your father's brother, has filed a claim that the deed you hold to this property was executed under fraudulent circumstances. Specifically, that your father was not of sound mind when he signed it, and that the property rightfully belongs to the Whitmore estate, of which your uncle is the executor." The sound of the name. Gerald. The cold in her chest got colder and then went strangely calm. The way temperatures always drop right before a storm. "My father was of sound mind," she said. "That's what the court will determine," Cole said. He pulled a folded paper from his vest. "I've got a judicial notice here requesting that you present the deed and any related documents to the circuit court in Laramie within 30 days. If you fail to appear, the property claim defaults to the estate." He held the paper out. She took it. She unfolded it. She read it carefully. Word by word, the way her father had taught her to read anything that someone was hoping you'd skim. "This notice doesn't require me to vacate the property," she said. "No, ma'am." "Or to surrender the deed." "No, ma'am." "Just to appear in court." "Then I'll appear in court," she said. She folded the notice with the same single fold she'd used on Fitch's deed and put it in her coat pocket. "Is there anything else?" Cole looked at her for a moment. He had the expression of a man who expected a different reaction and isn't quite sure what to do with the one he got. "You understand what's being alleged," he said. "If the court finds in your uncle's favor." "I understand," Clara said. "I'll appear in court. Good afternoon, Deputy." He stood there for another moment. Then he put his hat back on and got in the wagon, and the younger man followed, and they drove back down the road. Clara stood holding her measuring tape and did not move until the wagon was out of sight. Then she sat down on the ground where she was standing, put her back against the framing she'd spent 2 weeks building, and pressed her palms flat against the dirt. Her father's gift, the thing she was being asked to give up, and breathed. Gerald. Of course it was Gerald, her father's brother, who had contested the will from the day of the funeral, who had stood in the church hallway in his good suit and told Clara with the smooth certainty of a man who had already decided the outcome. Your father wasn't well, Clara. You know that. Whatever he wrote in that letter, whatever he said, a man in his condition isn't capable of making sound decisions about property. He had put his hand on her shoulder in the way that men do when they are claiming the right to something. The sensible thing would be to let me handle it. We're family. She had removed his hand from her shoulder. She had said he was perfectly well, Uncle Gerald. And I am going to Wyoming. She had walked away from him in the church hallway in front of 20 people, and she had not looked back. She had known, walking away, that he would not let it end there. She had known it and come anyway, because the alternative was giving him what he wanted. And she would rather be buried in Wyoming than let Gerald Whitmore add her father's land to the list of things he had taken from people who trusted him. She had the documents, the original deed, witnessed and properly executed. The doctor's letter from 3 months before her father died, certifying his full mental competency. The letter her father had written her, the real one. The long one, not the short version she'd shared with anyone who asked, that laid out exactly what Gerald had done to the family's finances over the past 10 years, and exactly what evidence existed to prove it, and exactly where that evidence was kept. She had all of it. She had carried it from Nebraska in the false bottom of a toolbox because she had known from the beginning that Gerald would come. What she hadn't calculated was how fast. Ethan arrived at noon to find the property quiet and Clara on the roof. This was not unusual. She was frequently on the roof. What was unusual was the way she was working too fast. The hammer coming down harder than necessary, the efficiency of her movements gone slightly ragged at the edges. He had spent enough time watching her work to know what her normal rhythm looked like. And this wasn't it. He tied his horse to the post. He got his tools. He climbed the ladder to the roof without asking, which was something he'd started doing about 2 weeks ago when they'd both silently acknowledged that the asking was unnecessary. He came up beside her. He looked at what she was working on. He picked up the secondary board and held it where it needed to go. And she drove the nails without speaking, and they worked like that for a while. After the third board, he said, "You going to tell me?" She drove the last nail on the board. She sat back on her heels. She kept her eyes on her work. 2 men from Laramie came this morning, she said. He waited. My uncle is contesting the deed, she said. She said it flat, the way he talked about May's mother like a fact she had rehearsed until it stopped being anything else. He's filed a claim with the circuit court. Says my father wasn't of sound mind. Ethan didn't say anything right away. He held the next board where it needed to be, was he? No, Clara said, with a sudden fierceness that startled him. She looked at him directly for the first time since he'd come up. No, he was not. He was perfectly well. Perfectly clear. He knew what he was writing and he knew why. Gerald has been trying to take this land since before my father died, and I knew he would, and I came anyway, and I will not. She stopped. She looked away. I will not let him have it. What kind of evidence does he have? Whatever he manufactured, she said. Gerald is very good at manufacturing things. He's been doing it for 20 years. She picked up the hammer. He had a doctor in Nebraska, one he paid, who claimed my father showed signs of confusion in the months before he died. It's a lie. I have a letter from my father's actual physician. I have the original deed. She stopped again. Took a breath. I have everything I need to prove he's lying. I just have to get it in front of a judge before Gerald finds a way to make it disappear. Ethan looked at her. He looked at her for long enough that she looked back. The toolbox, he said. She went very still. The one you move every night, he said. You've had it in a different place every day since I started coming here. Never the same spot. Always within reach. He'd noticed it in the second week. Had not said anything, because it wasn't his business, and she hadn't offered, and he didn't push into things that weren't offered. That's where it is. She held his gaze for a long moment. Yes, she said. He nodded once. He held the next board. You weren't going to tell me, he said. It wasn't an accusation. Just an observation. She drove the first nail. I'm not. She drove the second. I'm not used to telling people things. I know, he said. That's all right. She stopped. She looked at him. You're not going to ask me to leave. No, he said. You're not going to tell me this is too complicated and you don't want any part of it. No. Why not? She said it genuinely, the real question underneath it. The one she'd been waiting to ask. Ethan, this is going to get worse before it gets better. Gerald doesn't stop. He doesn't back down. He will send more men and he will put pressure on this town and on you specifically. Because you've been seen here, and because he is very good at making people feel like being associated with me is a dangerous thing to be. So why are you Clara? He said her name for the first time without the miss in front of it. And the sound of it stopped her mid-sentence. He said it again. Quietly. Clara. He set the board down. He turned to look at her fully. I had a wife who died in this country while I was doing everything right and playing it safe and making the sensible decisions. I have a daughter I see twice a year because I decided that the safe choice was the right choice. He looked at her steadily. I am done making the safe choice, if that's what you're asking. Clara looked at him. The wind came off the mountains and went through the roof frame. And somewhere down in the lower field, one of her mules made a sound about something. And from the north ridge, from the direction of Ethan's place, though you couldn't see it from here, a single crow called once and went silent. I wasn't asking, she said finally. I was warning you. I heard the warning, he said. And he picked up the board, held it to the mark. And I need you to nail this. She nailed it. They finished the section in silence. And when they came down from the roof in the slanting afternoon light, Clara went to the toolbox and moved it to the new spot she'd chosen under the south wall. Behind the fourth post, covered with a canvas she'd weighted down with stones, and Ethan watched her do it and didn't say anything about what it meant that she'd let him see where she put it. He understood what she was giving him in letting him see. He understood it the same way he'd understood when she hadn't looked away from Roy Dunham and hadn't cried in front of the deputy marshals and hadn't flinched when May turned those inventory eyes on her. Clara Whitmore was afraid. She had been afraid since before she got here. She was afraid right now. She just refused to let it be the loudest thing in the room. And standing in the long afternoon shadow of the walls that she had built, with her bleeding hands and her borrowed manual and her absolute refusal to stop, Ethan Callahan understood something he had been trying not to understand for 3 weeks. He was not going to be able to keep his distance from this woman. He was not sure he wanted to. He was absolutely certain he was going to have to decide what to do about that before things got worse. And things, he was quite sure, were going to get worse. The letter that arrived at his place the next morning confirmed it. It had no return address. It had his name on the outside, written in a careful, educated hand. He opened it at the kitchen table while May was still asleep. He read it twice. He set it down flat on the table and put both hands on either side of it and looked at it the way you look at something you wish you hadn't seen. It said, Mr. Callahan, you are a man of good standing in this county. The woman you are associating with is under judicial inquiry for property fraud. Whatever she has told you, she is not what she appears. Walk away from this situation while you still can. There are people watching, and they are not patient people. No signature. He picked it up, he folded it. He put it in his pocket. He got up, told May he'd be back for supper, saddled his horse, and rode down the ridge toward the Miller plot. He arrived at 9 in the morning, 3 hours earlier than usual. Clara was at the south wall when she heard him coming. She turned. She saw his face, and she knew, with the immediate certainty of someone who has been bracing for impact for a long time, that it had arrived. "What happened?" she said. He rode up to the fence post. He dismounted. He held out the letter. She took it. She read it. She handed it back. "Gerald," she said. "Or someone who works for him." "Who is Gerald?" Ethan said. "All of it. I need to know all of it." She looked at him for a moment. The sun was still low, and the morning was cool in the way Wyoming mornings are before the heat sets in. And the birds were loud in the brush by the creek. And Clara Whitmore stood in front of the house. She was building on the land her father had left her, and she made a decision. She told him everything. She told him everything. Not the way people tell things when they want sympathy. Not with pauses calculated for effect or words chosen to make themselves look better than the circumstances warranted. Clara told it the way she did everything else. Straight. Clean, without ornamentation, starting at the beginning and going to the end without doubling back. Her father's name was Thomas Whitmore. He had been a schoolteacher in Lincoln, Nebraska for 22 years. He had owned through inheritance from his own father 240 acres of farmland outside the city, plus the 40 acres in Wyoming that had come to him through a land grant he'd applied for in 1879 and's mostly forgotten about until the letter from the territory office arrived in 1884 confirming its transfer. The Nebraska land was good land, productive land, the kind of land that a man in Thomas Whitmore's position should have been able to leave to his daughter without any particular complication. Except for Gerald. Gerald Whitmore was 4 years younger than Thomas, and he had spent his entire adult life operating in the specific manner of men who believe that what belongs to their family belongs to them, by extension borrowing money he never intended to repay, making business decisions that cost other people more than they cost him, and using the Whitmore name with the easy confidence of someone writing checks on an account he didn't own. By the time Thomas died, Gerald had borrowed against the Nebraska land 3 times using documents that he had, Clara believed, forged Thomas's signature on, and had sold the mineral rights to a portion of it to a mining interest out of Denver without Thomas's knowledge. Thomas had found out about the mineral rights sale 8 months before he died. He had confronted Gerald. Gerald had denied everything. And then Gerald had done what Gerald always did when cornered. He had pivoted. Within 2 weeks, he had begun telling people that Thomas was confused, that the illness was affecting his mind, that poor Thomas wasn't quite himself lately, wasn't quite following what was happening around him, needed someone to step in and manage his affairs before he made decisions he wasn't capable of making. The doctor he'd found to support this, a man named Pruitt, who had a practice in Omaha and a fondness for that kind of money that came with saying what powerful men needed, said had visited Thomas twice, spent a combined total of 40 minutes in his presence, and produced a letter suggesting early cognitive decline. Thomas, who had spent those same 2 weeks reviewing documents, copying evidence, writing letters, and making careful arrangements for his daughter's future, had been furious. He had also been dying. The cancer that had been quiet for 2 years had decided to stop being quiet, and he had known by December that the spring was not a reasonable expectation. So he had done what he could do in the time he had. He had written everything down, the forged signatures, the borrowed money, the mineral rights sale, the names of the people Gerald had dealt with, and the dates of the transactions and the location of every piece of evidence that existed to prove what his brother had done. He had gotten his own doctor, his actual doctor, a man named Hargrove, who had treated him for a decade and who had a spine to produce a letter certifying his full mental competency, dated 2 weeks after Pruitt's letter, and he had reaffirmed the Wyoming deed in front of 2 witnesses, both of whom were men of standing, neither of whom had any connection to Gerald. And then he had written Clara a letter, not the short one that said, "Go build something," the long one, the one that was 12 pages of his careful school teacher handwriting. laying out every piece of the situation, with the thoroughness of a man who knows he is writing the last important document of his life and intends to get it right. Clara had that letter. She had all of it, the deed. Hargrove's letter, the copy of the evidence her father had assembled, and the long letter itself in the false bottom of the toolbox under the south wall. She told Ethan all of this in one sustained flow, standing in the morning light in front of her half-built house. And when she was done, no trailing off. No qualification, just the end of the story where it currently stood. Ethan had not interrupted once. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How much does Gerald stand to lose if you win?" "Everything he's built in the last 10 years is built on what he took from my father," she said. "If the court sees the evidence, the mineral rights sale gets unwound. The borrowed money becomes theft. The forged signatures become fraud." She looked at him steadily. "He would lose the Nebraska land. He would probably lose his freedom. So he has every reason in the world to make sure you don't get to court." "Yes." Ethan looked at the toolbox under the south wall. He looked at the house around them, the walls she'd built, the roof she'd started, the window frame facing east for the morning light. He looked at Clara. "The men who came yesterday," he said. "The deputy marshals. Gerald has contacts in the Laramie office," Clara said. "I don't know if Cole is one of them, or if he's just doing his job. The notice was legal. The process is real. But the timing," she stopped. "He waited until I was established here, until I'd spent money on the land and the materials and the work. Because now walking away costs me more. He wants you desperate," Ethan said. "He wants me to make a mistake," she said. "Desperate people make mistakes. They trust the wrong people. They take the wrong deals. They show up at the wrong time with the right evidence and hand it to someone who hands it to him." She looked at Ethan with the particular directness that he had come to understand was how she said things she needed him to hear exactly. "That is why I didn't tell you, not because I don't trust you. Because I did not want you in this. It was not fair to put you in this." He looked at her for a long moment. "Clara," he said, "I've been in this since the day I came down off that ridge." She looked away. Her jaw worked once. She looked back. "I know," she said. "All right then," he said. He moved to the south wall and crouched down by the toolbox. "We need to move this." She blinked. "What? It's the first place someone looks," he said. He stood up. "It's been under that wall since you got here. Anyone watching this property for more than a week knows you've got something under there." He met her eyes. "I want to take it up to my place. Lock it in the strongbox in my barn. Nobody outside of Harrow Creek knows I've got a strongbox, and nobody in Harrow Creek has ever had a reason to care." She was very still. "That's everything I have. I know. If something happened to it, nothing's going to happen to it," he said. It was not the empty reassurance of a man who didn't understand what he was taking on. It was the flat declaration of a man who had decided something. "That's why I want it in my place and not yours." Clara looked at the toolbox. She looked at Ethan. She thought about her father, writing 12 pages of careful handwriting in a cold December in Nebraska, trusting that she would know what to do with it. She picked up the toolbox and held it out. He took it with both hands. May was at the kitchen table doing her lessons when Ethan came in with the toolbox. She looked at it, then at him, and did not ask any questions, which was one of the many things he was grateful for about his daughter. He put it in the strongbox in the barn, turned the key, put the key on the chain around his neck under his shirt. He came back inside and poured coffee and sat down at the table across from May. "Is Miss Whitmore in trouble?" May said, without looking up from her primer. "She's working through some things," Ethan said. "Is that why you brought her box?" "Yes." May turned a page. "Is she going to be okay?" Ethan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I'm going to do my best to make sure she is." May looked up at that. She looked at him with Eleanor's eyes, steady, thorough, reading the thing underneath the thing he'd said. Then she nodded once. With the gravity of a 9-year-old who has decided to approve of something. and went back to her primer. Ethan drank his coffee and thought about Gerald Whitmore, a man he'd never met, and felt the particular cold clarity of someone who has located a threat and begun calculating distance. The thing about small towns is that they talk. And the thing about talking is that it travels. And the thing about travel is that it is not selective about its destination. By the end of the week, 3 things had happened. The first was that Aldous Fitch came to see Clara at the property. He arrived on horseback, which was unusual for Fitch, who preferred the dignity of a buggy. He was not his usual cheerful self. He was careful and quiet, in a way that set Clara's teeth on edge before he opened his mouth. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I've had some communication from the circuit court office in Laramie regarding the deed to this property." "I've had the same communication," Clara said. She kept working. She did not stop working. "There's some concern," Fitch said, "about the provenance of the paperwork. Some question about whether the deed is valid," Clara said. "It was properly executed and witnessed. My father was of sound mind and full legal competency. I have documentation from his physician to that effect." She drove a nail. "Is there something specific you need from me, Mr. Fitch?" Fitch was quiet for a moment. "The court's inquiry could take some time," he said. "Months, possibly. During that period, there are parties who might be interested in acquiring the property at a fair price. It would resolve the uncertainty and allow you to know," Clara said. "Miss Whitmore." No, she looked at him directly. "I am not selling. I am not negotiating. I am going to appear in the circuit court in Laramie with my documentation, and I am going to prove the deed is valid, and I am going to come back here and finish building my house." She held his gaze. "If you have parties who are interested in purchasing this property, they are going to be disappointed. Is there anything else?" Fitch left. Clara drove the next nail so hard the board cracked, and she had to pull it out and start again. She made herself slow down. She made herself breathe. She replaced the board and drove the nail correctly, and did not let her hands shake. Not where anyone could see. The second thing that happened was that Roy Dunham called a meeting. She found out about it from May, of all people May, who had developed the habit of stopping by the property on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, when Ethan had ridge chores that kept him up top until later, bringing nails and questions, and the particular steady companionship of someone who showed up because they wanted to and not because they felt they should. May arrived on Thursday, looking like she'd been thinking hard about something since Wednesday. "Papa heard something in town yesterday," she said, handing Clara a nail with the precision she'd developed over the past 2 weeks. "What did he hear?" "Mr. Dunham is having people to his place Saturday evening." May handed another nail. "Some of the men who own land near here. Papa wasn't invited, but Miss Lassiter told him about it." Clara drove the nail, held out her hand for the next one. "What are they meeting about?" May looked at her with those clear eyes. "You," she said. Clara took the nail, drove it. "Did your father say anything about it?" "He said some words I'm not supposed to repeat," May said. "And then he said he was going to go into town. Did he go?" "Yes," May said. "He came back after supper. He didn't say much. But he looked," she paused, finding words. "He looked like he did right after Mama died. Like he was holding something very heavy and not letting anyone help him with it." Clara sat back on her heels and looked at May. 9 years old, she thought, and she sees him more clearly than most adults ever would. "He's all right," Clara said. "He's just thinking through something difficult." "Are you?" May said. Clara looked at this child, this girl, with her father's jaw and her mother's eyes, and nobody else's way of asking the exact question you weren't ready for. "Yes," Clara said. "But I've thought through difficult things before." May nodded. She handed the next nail. "Papa says the thing about difficult things is you don't have to think them through alone." Clara looked at the nail in her hand for a moment. "Your papa is smarter than he looks," she said. "I know," May said. "He just forgets sometimes." The third thing that happened was the worst. It happened on a Friday morning, before Ethan came down from the ridge. When Clara was alone at the property doing the framing work she preferred to do without the distraction of another person's presence, the detail work, the fitting, the places where she needed to be inside her own head. A man came on horseback, alone. He was not from Harrow Creek, and he was not one of the deputy marshals from Laramie. He was maybe 50, lean, with a face that had been weathered so long it had gone beyond character into something that was just the aftermath of a great many decisions. He wore a coat that was too warm for the weather, and he kept his right hand near his belt in the casual, habitual way of someone who does this without thinking about it anymore. He stopped at the property line. He did not get down. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I don't know you," Clara said. She set down her tools. She moved so the south wall was at her back. "Name's Holt," he said. "I work for Mr. Gerald Whitmore. He asked me to come have a conversation with you." "Gerald can have his conversation with me in a courtroom," Clara said. Holt smiled, the way men smile when they are not surprised by the answer they got. "He thought you might say that. He wanted me to tell you some things that might change your thinking before it goes that far." He shifted in the saddle. "First thing is that the witnesses on your father's deed have both provided statements to the court saying they were not present when the document was signed. That they signed blank paper and were told afterward what it had been used for." Clara felt the cold go through her. She kept her face still. "That's a lie," she said. "Might be," Holt said pleasantly. "Might be two men in Nebraska who recollect things differently than you do. Courts have a hard time with that kind of conflict." He looked at the house she'd built. "Second thing is that the physician's letter you've been counting on, Dr. Hargrove, out of Lincoln. Dr. Hargrove has agreed to revise his assessment of your father's competency. In light of, as he put it, information that has recently come to his attention." Clara felt her stomach drop. Hargrove, the one witness she had believed was incorruptible. The one she had built the whole structure of her case around. Because Hargrove had treated her father for a decade and had never shown any sign of being the kind of man who could be bought. Gerald had bought him anyway, or threatened him, or found something. It didn't matter which, the effect was the same. "What does Gerald want?" she said. Her voice was steady. She had no idea how it was steady. Some deep-trained part of her was keeping it steady, while the rest of her rearranged itself around this new information. "He wants the deed surrendered and the property transferred to the estate," Holt said. "He's prepared to give you 6 months to vacate and $500 toward resettlement. Given your situation, he considers that generous." "Given my situation," she repeated. "A young woman alone," Holt said. "No family, no resources to speak of. Now that you've spent most of what you had on this." He glanced at the house. "With witnesses recanting and a physician revising his assessment, your case is considerably thinner than you may have thought. Mr. Whitmore is offering you a way out that doesn't end with you losing everything and having nothing to show for it." Clara looked at him. She thought about her father at the kitchen table in December, writing 12 pages in the cold. She thought about what he had looked like the last time she had seen him, thin, tired, but with his eyes clear and his voice steady and his hands on her face when he said, "Go build something. My girl, stop waiting for permission." She thought about the deed in the toolbox in the strongbox in Ethan's barn, and the long letter folded inside the deed, and every word of that letter that she had read so many times she could recite it. Gerald had bought Hargrove, but Hargrove's letter wasn't the only thing in that toolbox. The long letter named names. It named dates. It named amounts. It named the man in Denver who had brokered the mineral rights deal and the bank in Omaha that had processed the money and the notary in Lincoln, who had been present when Gerald had filed the forged loan documents, and who had, according to her father's careful notes, kept a copy of everything, because he was the kind of man who understood that keeping copies was how you stayed out of other people's trouble. Gerald did not know about the notary. Clara knew about the notary because her father had told her, in the letter, exactly who he was and where he worked and what he had. Gerald could buy Hargrove. He could pressure the witnesses. He could file inquiries and send men with letters and hold meetings in Roy Dunham's parlor. But he could not undo a notary's copy of his own forged signature sitting in a lockbox in Lincoln, Nebraska. He didn't know she had that piece, and she was not going to tell Holt. "Tell Gerald," Clara said, "that I'll see him in court." Holt looked at her for a long moment. The pleasant expression had gone somewhere neutral. "That's your final answer?" "That's my answer," she said. He looked at the house one more time. "You've done good work here," he said. And it was almost kind, which was somehow worse than if it hadn't been. "It'd be a shame." He rode away. Clara sat down on the south wall and put her hands between her knees and pressed them together to stop the shaking. She sat there for a long time. The birds were very loud. The sky was the deep, clear blue that Wyoming does better than anywhere she had ever been. She was still sitting there when Ethan arrived. He took one look at her and tied his horse and came to sit beside her on the wall. He did not ask what happened. He just sat after a while. She told him. She told him about Holt, about the witnesses, about Hargrove. She told him without looking at him, speaking at the middle distance, and when she was done, she said, "He doesn't know about the notary. My father mentioned him in the long letter." Gerald's never seen the long letter. He thinks the deed and Hargrove's letter are all I have. Ethan was quiet. "A notary in Lincoln with a copy of the forged documents," he said slowly. "His name is Cavanagh, Robert Cavanagh. My father trusted him because he'd known him 20 years. She finally looked at Ethan. "If I can get a message to Cavanagh, if he still has the copies, and he'll produce them, Gerald's case falls apart. The forgeries invalidate everything he's done, not just the Wyoming land. The Nebraska land, the mineral rights. Can you get a message to him? I can write one," she said. "I don't know who delivers it. The post is slow and I don't." She stopped. "I don't know who I trust in this town to carry it. Fitch has already shown me where he stands. The deputy marshals may be Gerald's. I don't know who Roy Dunham has spoken to." She looked at her hands. "I don't know who's watching." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I know someone." She looked at him. "Tom Greer," he said. "He runs freight between here and Cheyenne. He's been doing it for 6 years, and he's never been involved in town business, because he doesn't live here. He just passes through. He's not connected to Dunham or Fitch, or anyone who might have a reason to care." He looked at her. "He comes through Wednesday. I can talk to him Tuesday evening. If Cavanagh writes back, the reply comes to my place, not yours." Clara looked at him. Something in her chest did something complicated that she was not ready to name. "Ethan," she said. "I know," he said. "You understand what this means. If Gerald finds out you're involved, really involved, not just helping me build, he will come after you. He will look at May, at your land, at everything you've built here, and he will use it." "I know," he said again. "Then because it's right," he said. He said it like it was simple, which it wasn't, and at the same time it was. He said it the way her father had said things when he'd made up his mind, flat and clear and done. "And because I am not the kind of man who walks away from something that's right, because it's also hard. I used to be. I'm done being that man." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay." He nodded. "Write the letter tonight. Bring it tomorrow. I'll have it to Greer by Wednesday." She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the small tent she'd been living in. Since she arrived, she was not going to sleep in the half-built house before it had a roof, which was a firm principle, and she listened to the Wyoming night and thought about her father, and thought about Gerald, and thought about a notary in Lincoln who had kept copies and might or might not still have them, and might or might not be willing to produce them. She thought about Ethan. She thought about what it meant, what it really meant, that he had sat beside her on that wall and not moved until she was ready to talk, and had listened without flinching, and had said, "I know someone," in the steady, unhurried voice of a man who has decided to be in something with you. She was not used to that. She was not sure what to do with it. She had spent enough of her life being left that being stayed with felt like something she needed to be careful about. Like a piece of ice that might or might not hold weight. She wrote the letter to Kavanaugh by lamplight, 2 pages. She said what she needed to say clearly and without excess her father's daughter in that. Always, and she sealed it and put it in her coat pocket and lay back down. She was almost asleep when she heard it, horses. More than 2. Coming from the direction of the road, and then not going past. Stopping. She was on her feet before she was fully awake. Boots in her hand, moving to the tent opening to look without being visible. 3 riders. At the edge of the property line, they had lanterns but they weren't using them. They were letting the moonlight do the work. Which meant they didn't want to be seen. They were sitting still. Looking at the house. Clara's blood went cold. She watched them for 2 minutes. They didn't dismount. They didn't speak, or if they did, it was too low to carry. They just looked at the house she'd built. Then one of them reached into his coat, and she thought for one terrible. Clear second rifle. It wasn't a rifle, it was a bottle. She understood what kind of bottle when she saw the rags stuffed in the neck. She was out of the tent and across the property in 10 seconds. Moving low and fast through the dark, and she did the only thing she could think of. She screamed. Not in fear, in fury and in strategy, because the one thing men doing quiet things in the dark are most afraid of is noise. Hey! She came out from behind the south wall at a dead run. Picking up the hammer she'd left there, and she was 50 feet away and covering ground fast, and she screamed again. Get off my land! The horses shied. The man with the bottle grabbed his reins. One of the other horses turned full around, and the rider nearly came off. They ran, all 3 of them, back down the road the way they came. Clara stood at the property line with her hammer, breathing hard, and watched them go until the sound faded. Then she turned around and sat down in the dirt in the dark and let her heart run itself out. She was still sitting there when she heard another set of hooves. Coming fast from the north, from the ridge, and she had just enough time to think he heard it before Ethan came over the low rise at a canter. No hat, no coat, rifle in hand. He pulled up at the property line. He looked at her sitting in the dirt. He looked at the house. He looked at the road. What happened? He said. 3 men, she said. One of them had a bottle with a rag in it. He went very still. They ran, she said. I came out and made noise and they ran. He dismounted. He came to where she was sitting and stood over her and looked at the road for a long moment, reading whatever he could read from it in the dark. Then he crouched down to her level. He was close enough that she could see his face clearly in the moonlight, the controlled anger on it. The searching look. He ran over her to check for damage. The moment when he confirmed she was unhurt, and the anger got louder because there was no longer damage to assess, and so there was nothing to focus on except what had almost happened. Are you hurt? He said. No. I'm sure. Ethan. He was quiet. He looked at the house again, her walls, her roofline, the window facing east. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, You're not staying here alone tonight. She opened her mouth. Clara. His voice was quiet and completely certain. You can argue with me about a lot of things. Not this one. She looked at him. She thought about the man with the bottle and the rag, and the way he'd reached into his coat so casually. Like he'd done this before, like it was a thing people did, and you just had to pick the right night for it. All right, she said. He helped her up. He kept his hand at her elbow for 1 moment longer than was strictly necessary and then released it. And she was aware of that in the specific way that you are aware of the absence of something. Get what you need, he said. You'll stay up at my place. May will want to see you in the morning anyway. She got her coat. Her father's toolbox, which was empty now, its contents safe in Ethan's strongbox. But she took it anyway, because it was her father's, and she was not leaving it alone, and the letter to Kavanaugh, which was still in her pocket. As they rode up the ridge, Clara looked back at the house below. It was still standing. Every log she'd dragged, every nail she'd driven, every wall she'd framed in bleeding and aching and refusing to stop it was still standing. In the moonlight it was just a shape, but it was a real shape. A solid one. The shape of something that had been built by a person who refused to be removed from the land she had been given. Gerald had sent men in the dark because he was afraid of what she had in broad daylight. That meant she was still winning. She held on to that thought and rode up the ridge toward the light in Ethan's window. And behind her, the house she had built stood in the Wyoming night. And it did not fall. She slept in May's room, on the spare cot, and May, who had been woken by the sound of her father leaving fast and had been sitting up waiting since, climbed out of her bed and sat on the cot beside Clara and did not ask any questions. Just sat there with the particular small warmth of a child who understands that sometimes sitting is what's needed. Clara put her arm around her. May leaned in. They sat there like that until May fell asleep against her shoulder. And Clara sat awake a while longer, looking at the dark ceiling, feeling the even weight of this child against her side, and thinking about how strange it was, how completely disorienting strange to feel, in the middle of the worst night of the last several months. Something that was not just fear, something that felt like belonging. She did not know what to do with that either. In the morning, Ethan was already up when she came into the kitchen. He had coffee on, and he handed her a cup without speaking. And she took it and stood at the window and looked down at the valley below, where the Miller plot sat in the early light, with its walls and its roof and its east-facing window frame. Intact. Gerald miscalculated, she said. Ethan looked up from the table. He sent men to scare me, she said, or to burn it. Either way, he thinks that's what it takes to move me. She looked at Ethan. That means he doesn't know yet. About Kavanaugh. About the letter. He's still working on the assumption that the witnesses and Hargrove are enough. He thinks I'm about to break. Ethan was quiet, watching her. He's going to push harder, she said, when I don't. Yes, Ethan said. And the next time might not be 3 men in the dark who run when a woman screams, she said. No, he said. It might not. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. And the morning light came through the window, and the coffee was hot, and down in the valley her house was still standing. And Clara felt the fear, and she felt the anger underneath the fear, and she felt, deeper still, the thing her father had put in her when he'd pressed his hands to her face and told her to go build something. The certainty, the absolute, unreasonable, unshakable certainty that this land was hers and she was not going to leave it. Then we better get that letter to Kavanaugh, she said. Tom Greer comes through Tuesday, Ethan said. We've got 2 days. 2 days is enough, she said. She drank her coffee. She had no idea yet what Gerald had already set in motion. She had no idea that the Tuesday morning Tom Greer was supposed to come through Harrow Creek. Something was going to happen that would blow every calculation she'd made wide open and leave her standing in the middle of a situation she had not prepared for, not because she hadn't been careful, but because Gerald Whitmore had not, after all, been working alone. She had been looking at one enemy. There had always been 2. The second enemy had a name Clara already knew. She just hadn't understood, until Tuesday morning, what that name meant in the context of everything else. Aldous Fitch had been the land agent in Harrow Creek for 11 years. He had processed more deeds and title transfers in this county than any other man alive, which meant he knew where every piece of paper was, who had signed it, and what it was worth to the people who needed it to say something different than it said. He had smiled too wide when he handed Clara her deed, not because he was a friendly man, but because he already knew what Gerald Whitmore had planned and had already agreed to his part in it. And the smile was the smile of a man watching the first move of a game he was confident he was going to win. Clara found this out from Tom Greer. Tom Greer was not what she'd expected. She had built him up in her mind as someone solid and reliable, because Ethan had said he was solid and reliable. And Ethan was not a man who used words carelessly. What she had not expected was a man of maybe 60. short, with a gray beard and the kind of eyes that had seen enough of human nature to be unsurprised by most of it. He came through Harrow Creek on Tuesday morning, and he stopped at the North Ridge on the way out of town, as Ethan had arranged, and he sat at Ethan's kitchen table and drank coffee and told them what he'd heard. He had heard it in Fitch's office. He made freight deliveries to Fitch's office, 4 times a year supply orders. Territorial documents, the kind of paperwork that a land agent accumulated in large quantities. He had been in the office waiting for a signature 2 Fridays ago. The Friday after the deputy marshals had come to see Clara. And Fitch had not known he was in the back room, because Fitch had been in the front. And Fitch had been talking to someone. The someone had been Gerald Whitmore. Not in person, Greer was clear about this. By telephone, which Fitch had installed the previous year, one of only 3 in the county. Gerald's voice had been on the other end, carrying thin and metallic through the earpiece. But Greer had been close enough, and the office had been quiet enough. What he had heard was this: Fitch had been handling the deed records. He had access to the original filing. He had the ability, the legal, documented ability, as the county land agent, to attach a notation of disputed title to any deed in his records, which would trigger an automatic hold on any sale, transfer, or legal proceeding related to that property until the dispute was resolved. He had already filed that notation on Clara's deed 2 days after the deputy marshal's visit. And he had been asked by Gerald to also locate and flag any correspondence that came through the post office, which he also ran. Because in a town this size, one man held 3 jobs, and nobody thought twice about it addressed to or from Clara Whitmore. He had been reading her mail, which meant that if she had sent the letter to Kavanaugh through the regular post, Gerald would have known about it within the week. Clara sat at Ethan's kitchen table and processed this with the stillness of someone doing very fast calculations that cannot afford to be interrupted. "The notation on the deed," she said. "Can it be challenged?" "Can be," Greer said. "Takes time, circuit court motion, weeks minimum. More likely months. Does it affect the original court date?" "It complicates it," Greer said. Fitch's notation gives Gerald's lawyers grounds to request a delay. The longer they delay, the more time they have to work the witnesses, and anybody else you've got on your side. Clara looked at Ethan. He was looking at Greer, but she could see him thinking the particular focused stillness that meant he was ahead of the current sentence. Already at the next problem. "The letter," she said. She pulled it from her coat pocket. "This can't go through Fitch's post office." "No," Greer said. He looked at the letter. Then he looked at her with those unsurprised eyes. "I go through Cheyenne on my way back. There's a federal post office there. Different jurisdiction. Fitch has got no hand in it." He held out his hand. "I'll carry it myself, no charge." Clara looked at the letter. She had written it once, sealed it, carried it for 4 days. It had survived 3 men in the dark and 1 night on a cot in May's room and 2 cups of coffee and this conversation. She gave it to Greer. He tucked it inside his coat. He finished his coffee. He stood up and shook Ethan's hand and tipped his hat to Clara and said, "Whatever's in that letter, miss, I hope it's enough." And he went out and climbed on his wagon and drove south toward Cheyenne. Clara watched him go through the kitchen window. "How long?" she said. 10 days to 2 weeks for a reply," Ethan said. "If Kavanaugh writes back immediately, and if he doesn't." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Then we find another way." Clara looked at him. He was already moving, picking up his hat, checking his rifle, the efficient preparations of a man who has decided that waiting is a phase and action is what comes next. "What are you doing?" she said. "Going to pay a visit to Aldous Fitch," he said. "Ethan, not to make a scene," he said. He looked at her. "To let him know that I know. Men like Fitch, they operate on the assumption that their arrangements are invisible. When the arrangement stops being invisible, they get nervous. And nervous men make mistakes. Or they accelerate their timeline," Clara said. "Yes," he said. "Which is why we need to know what his timeline is before he runs it." She stood up. "I'm coming with you." He looked at her. He did not argue. They rode into Harrow Creek together, which was a thing they had not done before, not because they had avoided it, but because there had been no occasion. The occasion now was different. The occasion now was deliberate, and they both understood that. The town noticed. Clara felt it the way she always felt it, the peripheral awareness. The shift in the air when two people on the street looked at each other and then looked away. But there was something different about it this time. The looking was different. It had a quality she hadn't encountered before from these people, or hadn't encountered in this form, and it took her until they reached Fitch's office to identify it. It was uncertainty. They had been certain about her from the beginning. Certain she would fail, certain she would leave, certain she was something they could manage and redirect, and eventually resolve. The certainty was gone. What had replaced it was the particular discomfort of people who have bet on an outcome and are beginning to suspect they bet wrong. She did not smile about this, but she noted it. Fitch was behind his desk when they came in. And the thing about Aldous Fitch was that he was a man whose face told everything he was trying not to say. When he looked up and saw both of them, Ethan in the doorway, Clara a step behind him, he went through 3 different expressions in about 1 second. Surprise, calculation, and a careful neutrality that arrived too late to be convincing. "Ethan," he said, "Miss Whitmore." He did not stand up. Ethan came in and sat down in the chair across from Fitch's desk without being invited. Clara came in and stood. She had chosen to stand because she was better at this, standing better at being solid and present and difficult to ignore. "We need to talk about the notation on Miss Whitmore's deed," Ethan said. Fitch's eyes moved between them. "That notation is a standard procedural response to a court-filed dispute," he said. "I had no discretion in the matter. When a circuit court inquiry is filed, the county land office is required. You filed it 2 days after the marshal's visit," Ethan said. "Before any court order requiring it. I checked." He had checked. Clara had not known he had checked. She noted that too. "The notation was your initiative, Aldous, not the court's." Fitch opened his mouth. "Closed it. We also know about the post office," Clara said. The silence that followed was very informative. Fitch's hands, flat on the desk, did something small and involuntary. A tightening. He looked at Clara, and for the first time since she'd met him, the careful pleasantness was completely gone, and what was underneath it was just a man who had made a set of choices and was now in the room with the consequences. "I don't know what you think you know," he said. His voice had lost its ease. "I know that Gerald Whitmore called you by telephone," Clara said. "I know what was discussed. I know about the arrangement." She held his gaze. "And I know that what you've been doing with the mail is a federal offense. Mr. Fitch, whatever Gerald has promised you, I want you to think carefully about whether it's worth what it cost you when this goes in front of a federal judge instead of a circuit court." Fitch stared at her. He was, she realized, genuinely frightened. Not of her, or not only of her, but of the specific shape of the situation. The way it had just revealed itself to be larger and more documented than he'd believed. Men like Fitch made arrangements because they believed the arrangements were safe. He was currently recalculating the safety. "I have not broken any law," he said. But it was rote, automatic, the statement of a man testing whether he still believed it. "Then you have nothing to worry about," Ethan said. He stood up. He picked up his hat. "We just wanted to make sure you were aware that we're aware, in case it affected any decisions you might be making in the coming weeks." He walked out. Clara looked at Fitch for one more moment. "My father trusted the system," she said. "He believed that the right documentation in front of the right judge was enough. He was a school teacher. He believed in the law." She picked up her gloves from the desk where she set them. "I believe in the law too, but I also believe in making sure that the people who are supposed to uphold it understand that someone is watching them do it." She put on her gloves. "Good morning, Mr. Fitch." She walked out. Ethan was holding both horses at the rail. He handed her the reins without speaking, and they mounted and rode out of town at a steady pace. Not fast, not slow the pace of people who have done what they came to do and are not running from it. When they were clear of the main street, Clara said, "He's going to contact Gerald today." "I know," Ethan said. "Which means Gerald is going to know we know about Fitch." "I know that too. So we've accelerated his timeline," she said. "We've also disrupted his certainty," Ethan said. "He built this plan on the assumption that you were isolated, that you didn't have support here, didn't have information, didn't have anyone who would carry your mail to Cheyenne or tell you what they heard in a back room." He looked at her. "That assumption is no longer available to him. He has to rebuild his plan around a different one. And that takes time," Clara said. "It takes time," he agreed. "Kavanaugh's reply takes 2 weeks. We need about 2 weeks of Gerald being uncertain and off balance." He held her gaze. "Disrupting Fitch is how we buy that time." Clara thought about this. She thought about her father, who had believed in the law, and about Gerald, who had spent 20 years learning the places where the law had gaps, and about herself, who was somewhere in between, who believed in the law and also in the very practical matter of making sure the other side didn't have time to fill the gaps before you got there. "You planned that," she said. "Some of it," he said. When Greer told us about Fitch," he said, "I thought about what Gerald's next move is if he still thinks his plan is intact versus what it is if he finds out we're ahead of him. If he thinks he's still winning, he's patient. He lets the court process grind us down. If he finds out we know about Fitch, he rushes." He paused. "A rushed Gerald makes mistakes. A patient Gerald is harder to fight." Clara looked at him. "You've done this before," she said. "This kind of thinking. Not building cabins, this." He was quiet for a moment. "I was a deputy," he said, "before I came out here. 3 years in Missouri, before Eleanor." He didn't look at her. "I was good at it. I left because—" He stopped. "I didn't want to be good at things that meant being away from her." Clara absorbed this. Another piece of Ethan Callahan, delivered flat and matter-of-fact, in the way he delivered everything that cost him something to say. "I'm glad you were good at it," she said. He looked at her then. That look again, the one she still didn't have the right name for. The one that had been getting harder to look away from. "So am I," he said. "Right now. They had 8 days before everything broke open. Those 8 days had a particular quality that Clara would think about later, a compressed, vivid quality. The way time feels when you know it is running towards something, and you don't know exactly what shape the something will take." She finished the roof during those 8 days. She and Ethan worked fast and focused and without the leisure of the early weeks. Because the early weeks were gone, and what they were in now had a different weight. May's visit ended on the 6th day. Ethan drove her to the stage in the morning, and Clara stood at the property line and watched them go. And when May had leaned out the buckboard and waved the serious, whole arm wave of a child putting full effort into a goodbye, Clara had raised her hand back and held it there until they were out of sight. She stood there for a while after. The property was quiet. The house was nearly finished. She could see that now. Could see the thing that had lived in her father's letter becoming real. Becoming roof and wall and window and door. It was not the house she had imagined when she was 12. Or the house she had imagined when she was reading the builder's manual in a church library in Nebraska. It was something better. It was the house she had actually built, which was different from any house she had ever imagined because it had her in it, her choices, her calculations, her corrections, her bleeding hands, her days. She was still standing there when Roy Dunham came. He did not come in a wagon this time. He came on foot, which told her it wasn't official and wasn't for show. He came to the property line and stopped and looked at the house for a moment before he looked at her. And the expression on his face was one she had not seen from him before. Not the managed pleasantness, not the practiced authority. Something else. Something that looked like a man who has been running a plan for long enough that he has started to forget why he started it. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Dunham," she said. She did not move toward him. She did not move away. I heard you went to see Fitch, he said. I did. You know about. He stopped. He looked at the house again. Fitch told me about 12 years ago that this plot was bad land. Water access issues, foundation problems, something wrong with the soil in the east section. He said it like he was reading from a memory. I believed him. I've been believing him about a lot of things for a long time. Clara waited. He's been running this county's land records, Roy said. For 11 years. And I'm starting to think he stopped again. He had the look of a man doing arithmetic he should have done earlier and not enjoying the answers. How much of what I've said to you came from Aldous Fitch telling me what the situation was? Clara looked at him steadily. I don't know, she said. You'd have to answer that. I've been calling you a problem since the day you got here, he said. It came out low, almost ashamed. Told myself it was about the town. About order. About what was proper. He looked at the house she'd built. You built that. Mostly by yourself. I watched you and I kept waiting for you to fail because Fitch told me you would and because he didn't finish. Because I'm not what you expected a landowner to look like, Clara said. Quiet. No heat in it. Roy looked at the ground. He had the dignity. At least not to argue. What are you going to do, he said. I'm going to go to Laramie in 3 weeks and prove my deed is valid, she said. And when I come back, I'm going to live on this land for the rest of my life. He was quiet. Fitch, he said. Whatever he's into, I didn't know about that part. I want you to know that. All right, she said. If there's something I can do, you can tell people the truth, Clara said. About what you saw, about what she built. She held his gaze. That's enough. Roy Dunham put his hat back on. He looked at the house one more time. He turned and walked back to town. Clara watched him go and felt the slight specific shift of a weight redistributing itself, not gone, but changed, one fewer person pulling against her. She went back to work. The reply from Kavanagh arrived on the 9th day. Not through the Harrow Creek post office, through Tom Greer, who made an unscheduled stop on the ridge on his way back from his Cheyenne run and handed Ethan an envelope and said only. Man wrote back fast, said to tell you his answer is yes, his answer is yes. Ethan read it first. Then he rode down to the property and handed it to Clara without a word. And she read it standing in front of her finished house, because the roof was on. The door was hung. The window glass had arrived from town in a crate she'd carried herself. And the house was done, and her hands did not shake. Kavanagh had the copies, all of them, the forged loan documents, the mineral rights sale paperwork, the notarized record of Gerald's signature on instruments he had later claimed his brother had signed. He had kept them in a bank lockbox in Lincoln for 4 years because he had known, the day Gerald filed those documents, that they were wrong. And he had been a careful enough man to protect himself and idealistic enough, apparently, to protect the record. He would bring them to the circuit court in Laramie if served with a subpoena. He would come without a subpoena if Clara could get word to the circuit court judge before the hearing date. And he had, enclosed with his letter, a signed affidavit prepared. He wrote the day after Thomas Whitmore's funeral, when he had understood that the fight was coming and had decided which side he was on, attesting to everything he had witnessed and everything he had copied. Clara read it twice. She folded it carefully. She put it in her coat pocket. With the deed, with Hargrove's original letter, with her father's 12 pages. She looked up at Ethan. It's enough, she said. He looked at her. He had been watching her read, and his face had the expression she now had a name for, not pity, not admiration, something that lived in the space between those two things and was neither of them. The thing that a person's face does when they are watching someone they care about step into their own strength. She had named it 2 days ago, at 3 a.m, when she was lying awake thinking about all of it. She had named it, and then she had very carefully set the name aside, because there were other things to get through first. And you could not afford to be distracted by something that beautiful when the walls were still moving in. "We need to get this to the circuit court judge before Gerald does," she said. "There's a federal marshal's office in Laramie," Ethan said. "Independent of the circuit court. If we go directly there with the affidavit, they can flag the hearing and ensure the judge receives it through proper channels before Gerald's lawyers get their delay request in." "You know the federal marshal in Laramie?" "I know his deputy," he said. "From my time in Missouri. He came out here 4 years ago." A pause. "I saved his life once. He tends to remember that." Clara stared at him. "You saved his life," she said. "There were circumstances," Ethan said, in the tone of a man who is not going to elaborate. She almost laughed. It came up from somewhere low and real. And she pressed her lips together, because this was not the moment. But the almost law was there, and he saw it, and something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but close. "When can we go?" she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll send word to Ed Harlow tonight. We ride at first light." They did not make it to first light. Holt came back at dusk, not alone this time. He had 4 men with him, and they came directly to the property line, without circling, without waiting for dark, without the hesitation of men who are unsure of their authority. They came like men who had been given permission to stop being careful. Clara was inside the house when she heard them. She heard the horses, and she heard the specific quality of the silence that followed silence of several men stopping and not getting down, which is different from the silence of one man, and she came to the door and looked out. Holt, 4 men behind him, none of whom she recognized. One of them had a rifle resting across his saddle with the casual placement of a man who wants you to see it without him having to point it at you. "Miss Whitmore," Holt said. Same tone as before, same pleasant patience. "Mr. Whitmore's offer has changed." "How?" she said. She had her hand on the door frame. She did not come out. "It's no longer an offer," Holt said. "He's aware that you've made contact with Kavanaugh. He'd like you to understand that Kavanaugh's affidavit, whatever it says, is going to be challenged as the statement of a man with a personal grievance against the Whitmore estate. He'd also like you to understand that your situation has become," he paused, "complicated." "My situation," Clara said, "has been complicated since January. Miss Whitmore." Holt leaned forward on the saddle horn. His voice dropped, and the pleasantness drained out of it. "Gerald is willing to let you walk away clean. The $500. The 6 months. No legal complications, no further inquiries. You take that and you go somewhere and you start over." He looked at the house. "Or this gets worse than 3 men in the dark." Clara felt the fear. She felt it go through her, clean and cold and real. The way honest fear does not panic, but information. The information was, these men are serious. They have been authorized. And there are 4 of them and 1 of you. She kept her voice steady. "I'd like you to get off my property," she said. Holt straightened. He looked at her for a moment, not the calculating look of before, but something slower, something that might have been almost reluctant. He opened his mouth. "You heard her." The voice came from behind the men, from the direction of the ridge trail, and every one of them turned. Ethan came out of the tree line at a walk, leading his horse, rifle in one hand and the reins in the other. He had not been visible until he spoke. He had come down quiet, which meant he had come down early, which meant he had seen them coming from the ridge before they reached the property and had ridden around to come at them from behind. He stopped 20 feet behind Holt's group. He was relaxed in the way that only a man who is genuinely unafraid looks relaxed. Not performing calm, actually calm. The specific calm of a man who has made his decision and is not revisiting it. "She asked you to leave," Ethan said. "I'm asking you to leave. That's 2 people on their own property who've asked you the same thing." He looked at Holt directly. "Next time it'll be the sheriff, and I'll have the federal marshal's office in Laramie on a telegraph before morning. You know what a federal involvement does to Gerald's civil suit. You know it better than I do." Holt looked at him. He looked at Clara. He looked back at Ethan. One of the men behind him shifted. The man with the rifle moved it slightly. Ethan did not move. He just looked at them, steady and unrushed, and the rifle in his own hand was at his side and not raised. But everyone present understood the precise distance between at his side and raised, and how fast that distance could close. The man with the rifle put it back across his saddle. Holt looked at Clara one more time. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I've heard that before," Clara said. "From men who were wrong." Holt turned his horse. The 4 men turned with him. They rode off the property and down the road toward town. And Clara watched them go with her hand still on the doorframe and her heart running hard in her chest. When they were gone, she looked at Ethan. He was already coming toward the house, leading his horse, unhurried, checking the road with his eyes before he looked at her. "You came down early," she said. "Saw them from the ridge," she said. "Came down the back way." He tied his horse to the fence post. He came to the door. He stood close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the thing under the calm. The thing he'd been holding down while they were still there. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. She took a breath. "He knows about Kavanaugh, I heard, which means someone got to the mail in Cheyenne. Or someone got to Kavanaugh directly." Or she stopped. Or Greer. The word sat between them for one terrible second. Then Ethan said Greer brought the reply himself. He didn't have to. If he'd wanted to sell us out, he'd have handed the letter to Gerald and never come to us at all. Then how does Gerald know? Ethan was quiet. He thought. "Kavanaugh," he said slowly, "not Kavanaugh betraying us. Kavanaugh being watched." He looked at her. "If Gerald's been trying to manage this for 6 months, he knew Kavanaugh was a risk. He may have had someone watching him. When Kavanaugh sent a letter to Cheyenne, he flagged himself," Clara said. "Yes." She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment. Then she dropped them. "Does it change anything? The affidavit is already written and signed." "The copies exist." "No," Ethan said, "it doesn't change anything. Gerald knowing about Kavanaugh doesn't make Kavanaugh's affidavit disappear. It just means Gerald is going to move fast to discredit it." He looked at her steadily. "Which is exactly why we need to be in Laramie before him." "First light," she said. "First light," he agreed. She looked at him. He was still close. Still had that tension in his jaw, the thing under the surface. She understood, suddenly and fully, that the thing under the surface was not anger. It was not the controlled fury of a man who had faced down 5 strangers and held his ground. It was fear. "Ethan," she said. "I know," he said. The words were rough at the edges in a way his words rarely were. "I'm still standing," she said. He looked at her. He reached up and put one hand against the doorframe beside her head. Not touching her, just there steadying something. Or holding something. His eyes did what she had stopped letting herself look at too long, because looking too long was a thing she couldn't afford right now. "I know," he said again softer. "I need you to keep doing that." "I will," she said. He stepped back. He looked at the road one more time. The way he always checked the road. He looked at the house at the roof she'd finished. The door she'd hung. The east window with its glass catching the last of the day's light. "Sleep," he said. "We ride early." He went up the ridge. Clara closed the door of her house, her door, her hinges, her hands, and stood in the room that smelled of fresh pine and honest work. And breathed. Tomorrow was Laramie. Tomorrow was the judge. And Kavanaugh's affidavit, and the 12 pages of her father's careful handwriting, and the original deed witnessed and signed by 2 men whose names were on record and whose statements, whatever Gerald had told them to say, would have to hold up against a federal inquiry. Tomorrow was Gerald Whitmore standing on the other side of a courtroom from his dead brother's daughter, and finding out that she had not broken, and had not left, and had not made the mistake he had been waiting for. She was afraid. She was afraid, and she was ready, and those 2 things had been living together inside her for long enough that she no longer found it strange. She lay down on the floor of her finished house, wrapped in her blanket, and she looked at the ceiling she had built, and the wall see she had built, and the east window that would give her morning light for the rest of her life. And she slept. They rode out before the sun came up. No discussion about it. No ceremony. Ethan had the horses ready at the bottom of the ridge trail when Clara came down with her coat and her father's toolbox and the envelope that held everything: the deed, Hargrove's original letter, Kavanaugh's affidavit, and the 12 pages of her father's handwriting that she had read so many times the folds were wearing thin. She tied the toolbox to the back of the saddle and mounted up, and they rode south toward Laramie without looking back. The first hour was quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet of two people who have run out of things to say, but the working quiet of two people who are conserving what they have for what's ahead. Clara had learned that about Ethan in the weeks they'd worked together, that his silence was never absence. It was just a different form of presence. He was thinking. And what he was thinking was about her, and about Laramie, and about what needed to happen today. And the silence was full of all of that, even if none of it was spoken. She was thinking too. She was thinking about her father at the kitchen table in December. 12 pages of careful handwriting in the cold. She was thinking about Gerald, who had spent 20 years taking things from people who trusted him, and had built his whole life on the assumption that trust was a weakness you could exploit indefinitely. She was thinking about the witnesses, the two men who had signed the deed and then recanted, and what Gerald had offered them or threatened them with to make them say what they said, and whether a federal marshal's inquiry would change what they were willing to put their names on. She was thinking about what happened if it wasn't enough. She pushed that thought down, not a way down where it could be useful, where it would keep her sharp instead of frightening her into paralysis. Fear, she had learned, was only dangerous when you pretended it wasn't there. "Tell me about the federal marshal," she said. "Ed Harlow's deputy name's Carver," Ethan said. "James Carver. He was a deputy in St. Louis when I was there. Good man, careful. The kind who does his job because he believes in it, not because it pays." He looked at the road ahead. "In 1879, we had a situation with a man who'd been running a land fraud operation across 3 counties. Carver was the one who built the case. I was the one who went in when it went sideways, and the man decided he'd rather shoot his way out than be arrested." A pause. "Carver took a bullet in the process. I got him out. That's not a small thing," Clara said. "No," Ethan said, "it's not. And you think he'll help?" "I think he'll listen," Ethan said. "And when he reads Kavanaugh's affidavit, listening will be enough." Clara held on to that. Listening will be enough. She had spent her whole life trying to make herself heard by people who had already decided not to listen. And the idea that today she might walk into a room where the listening was guaranteed felt almost foreign. Almost like something that happened to other people. She was not other people. She was Thomas Whitmore's daughter. And she had ridden 2 hours in the dark toward a federal marshal's office with a toolbox full of evidence. And listening was going to have to be enough because it was all she needed. Laramie was bigger than Harrow Creek in the way that mattered not just in buildings and people, but in the specific atmosphere of a place where more than one kind of power operated simultaneously. There were territorial offices here, a courthouse, the federal marshal's building, and 3 competing banks. All of which meant there were people here who had seen enough of what men like Gerald Whitmore did to know it when they saw it. Carver's office was on the 2nd floor of the federal building. And Carver himself was a man of maybe 45 with a neat mustache and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned long ago that urgency was a state of mind you chose carefully. He looked up when Ethan came in, and something in his face shifted, not surprise, but recognition, the specific warm recognition of a man seeing someone he owes something to. "Callahan," he said. He stood up and put out his hand. "Carver," Ethan said. He shook it. "This is Clara Whitmore. She's got a situation that needs federal eyes." Carver looked at Clara. He looked at her the way a professional looked at someone who had come to him with a problem, assessing. Yes, but without the weight of prior judgment. He gestured to the chairs across from his desk. "Sit down, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Tell me," she told him. She laid it out the same way she had laid it out for Ethan, on that morning in front of the half-built house, straight. Clean, start to end, but this time with the documents on the desk in front of him, placed in order as she referenced them. The deed, Hargrove's letter, the witness's original signatures, the copy of Gerald's forged loan documents that Kavanaugh had provided in his affidavit, the 12 pages of her father's handwriting. Carver read as she talked. He did not interrupt. He turned pages with the careful attention of a man who understands that what he is reading is going to determine what happens next. And he takes that seriously. When she finished, the office was quiet. Carver looked at the affidavit for a long moment. Then he looked up. "The witnesses who recanted," he said. "Do you know what Gerald offered them?" "No," Clara said. "I know he has the pattern. He's done it before. The doctor in Omaha, the Hargrove revision. He finds people who are exposed to some pressure he can apply, and he applies it. These two men," Carver said. "Do they have families here?" She hadn't thought about that. "I don't know where they are now. They were in Lincoln when my father's deed was executed." "That was 18 months ago." Carver looked at Ethan. "You said there's a hearing date." 17 days, Ethan said. Carver tapped the affidavit with one finger. "Kavanaugh is willing to appear?" He said yes, Clara said. "He needs a subpoena to give him protection from Gerald's lawyers challenging his appearance as voluntary." "I can issue that," Carver said. He looked at the documents again. The forged signatures on the loan documents, if these copies match what's on file with the Omaha bank. That's a federal fraud matter. That moves this out of the circuit court's jurisdiction and puts it in mine. He looked at Clara directly. "Which means Gerald's lawyers can file delay requests with the circuit court until they run out of paper, and it won't matter. Because the matter will have been superseded." Clara felt something loosen in her chest. Just slightly. Just enough to breathe differently. "How long does that take?" she said. "If the copies are what Kavanaugh says they are." "I can have a federal filing by end of week," Carver said. The circuit court hearing becomes moot. Gerald's civil claim on the Wyoming property gets stayed pending the federal fraud investigation. He paused. "Which, depending on what the Omaha bank has on file, may become the least of Gerald Whitmore's problems." The silence that followed that statement had a particular quality. Clara sat in it and felt the shape of it, the shape of a door that had been locked for 6 months beginning to open. "There's one more thing," she said. Carver looked at her. "Aldous Fitch," she said. "The land agent in Harrow Creek. He's been interfering with my mail-reading correspondence through his post office and filed a premature disputed title notation on my deed, at Gerald's direction." She held Carver's gaze. "I want that on record, not as a primary complaint. As context. Because if Gerald goes down for the fraud and Fitch walks away clean, the next person who comes to Harrow Creek with a legitimate deed is going to find Fitch exactly where he was." Carver looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ethan. Then he looked back at Clara. "You've thought about this carefully," he said. "I've had time," she said. He nodded slowly. "I'll add Fitch to the investigation," he said. "Interference with federal mail is its own matter." He started writing. "I'm going to need your father's original letter as evidence, the 12 pages. I'll give you a receipt, and it will be returned to you when the proceedings are complete." Clara looked at the letter on the desk. Her father's handwriting, careful and precise, the last important document of his life. She slid it across the desk. "Take care of it," she said. "I will," Carver said, and she believed him. They were back outside and mounted before noon. And the ride back to Harrow Creek had a different quality than the ride down, not lighter. Exactly, because nothing was resolved yet. The investigation would take time and Gerald would fight it. There were weeks and possibly months of difficulty still ahead. But different. The direction had changed. The thing that had been pushing toward her was now, for the first time, also being pushed back. They rode for a while in silence. Then Ethan said, "You told him about Fitch." "Yes," she said. You didn't have to. It wasn't your fight. It's everybody's fight, Clara said. Fitch has been running those land records for 11 years. Every deed he's touched, every notation he's filed, every piece of correspondence he's read, all of that matters to someone. Not just me. She glanced at Ethan. You knew that. You knew it when you went to see him. When you said you wanted him to know that we knew. You weren't just doing it for me. Ethan was quiet for a moment. No, he said, I wasn't. Then we're the same, she said. He looked at her then, and the look was the one she had named 2 days ago at 3 in the morning. And she looked back at it this time, fully, without looking away. He looked away first, back at the road, but the side of his mouth had moved. Clara, he said. I know, she said. He glanced at her. What do you know? She kept her eyes on the road. I know what you're not saying, she said. I've known for a while. She stopped, started again. I didn't let myself think about it because there was too much else to think about. And because I stopped again, this was harder than courtrooms. Harder than federal marshals. I'm not used to being looked at the way you look at me, she said. I'm used to being assessed, measured, found to be too much of this or not enough of that. She felt her jaw tighten. You've never looked at me like that. Not once, not from the first day. He was very quiet. No, he said, I haven't. I don't know what to do with that, she said honestly. I'm telling you that plainly because you deserve plainness and because I don't have the patience for anything else. I know, he said. There was something in his voice, the rough edge again. The thing that happened when he was saying something that cost him. I don't need you to know what to do with it right now. I'm not going anywhere, and you've got a house to live in and a land case to win, and he stopped. I just need you to know that it's there. What I'm not saying. I need you to know I'm not going to take it back. Clara looked at the road. She felt the Wyoming morning around her and the solid weight of the horse under her and the envelope in her coat that had her father's deed in it. And she thought about a man who had watched her for 16 days and come down off his ridge, not because she had fallen, but because she had gotten back up. And who had held rope and carried lunch and faced down 5 men in the dark and ridden to Laramie and given a federal marshal the handshake that changed everything. Ethan, she said, yeah. When this is over, she said. When the case is settled and Gerald is dealt with and Fitch is handled, and I've slept in my own house for enough nights that it feels like mine, she paused. I'd like to have dinner with you. In my house. That I built. He was quiet for so long she thought she'd miscalculated. Then he said, I'll bring May. She felt the laugh come up again, real this time. Full. The kind she hadn't laughed since before her father died. She let it come. Bring May, she said. Gerald Whitmore arrived in Harrow Creek on a Thursday. 12 days after their ride to Laramie. He was not what Clara had pictured. She had built him in her imagination as large and loud. The way powerful men who do harm from a distance sometimes are as though the distance requires projection. He was neither. He was medium height, well-dressed, with a pleasant face that had the specific quality of a face that had been pleasant on purpose. For so long it had stopped being able to do anything else. He looked like the kind of man you trusted at a church function. He looked exactly like what he was, someone who had built a career on looking like what he wasn't. He came to the property. Clara was inside her house when she heard the wagon. And she came to the door and looked out and recognized him from the photograph her father had kept the family. Photograph from 1871. The one where Gerald stood with his hand on Thomas's shoulder and his smile at the camera and his eyes somewhere else entirely. He got down from the wagon. He straightened his coat. He looked at the house, really looked at it, taking it in, and something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. Not quite surprise. Something more like recalculation. He looked at her. Clara, he said. Gerald, she said. She did not come out of the doorway. She stood in it, her doorway. Her house, her land, and she looked at her father's brother and felt none of the things she had expected to feel. No grief, no rage. I came to talk to you directly, he said. Before this goes any further. I think if we have a real conversation, Carver filed the federal fraud complaint on Monday, Clara said. I expect you know that, since your lawyers would have been notified. Gerald's pleasant face did something careful. The federal complaint is an overreach, he said. That affidavit is the statement of a man with a long-standing grievance against our family. It won't hold up under scrutiny. The copies of the forged loan documents will, Clara said. Kavanaugh kept them notarized. The original signatures on file at the Omaha bank are your handwriting. Gerald, not my father's. The bank's own records show the account the money went into. Your account. She held his gaze. It's not Kavanaugh's word against yours. It's your own signature. The pleasant face went somewhere very still. You've been busy, he said. My father was a school teacher, she said. He believed in documentation. She looked at this man who had stood in a church hallway with his hand on her shoulder, telling her that her father wasn't well, that someone needed to manage things, that she should let him handle it. He documented everything, Gerald. Everything you did. He knew what you were doing for 2 years before he died. He just didn't have the strength left to fight you himself. She felt her voice steady itself, the way it always did when she got to the center of something. So he gave it to me. Gerald was quiet for a long moment. What do you want, he said. His voice had changed. The pleasantness was entirely gone now. What was underneath was just tired, the specific tiredness of a man whose plan has run into the thing it didn't account for. I want my land, Clara said. I want my father's name cleared. I want the Nebraska land returned to the estate and properly settled. I want Kavanaugh's copies entered into federal record. She looked at him. And I want you to understand clearly and permanently that there is nothing you can offer me. No version of a deal you can construct, no amount of money or time or convenience that is worth more to me than finishing what my father started. She stepped back into the doorway. The federal case proceeds. If you cooperate with the investigation, that's between you and Carver. But this land and this case, not now, not ever. Gerald looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at the house when he first arrived, that recalculation. That specific rearrangement of what he had believed was true. And Clara understood, watching him do it, that this was the moment. The moment when Gerald Whitmore finally looked at Thomas Whitmore's daughter and understood what he had underestimated. He had looked at her age, her size, her gender, her lack of connections in Wyoming, and he had seen someone manageable. Someone who could be pressured and redirected, and eventually, through enough accumulated difficulty, convinced to give up. He had not seen what she actually was. He had not seen what her father had seen from the beginning. Gerald got back in his wagon. He gathered his reins. He looked at her one more time from the wagon seat. And whatever he was going to say, he decided not to say it. He drove back down the road toward town. Clara stood in her doorway and watched him go and felt her hands, very slightly, begin to shake. She let them shake. She pressed them flat against the doorframe and breathed through it, and when it passed, she was still standing in her own doorway, on her own land. And the shaking was gone, and the clarity remained. Ethan was there by noon. He had seen Gerald's wagon from the ridge and had come down at a pace that was not quite a run, but was close. He came to the door and looked at her, and she said, He came. He left. It's done, and he let out a breath that told her he'd been holding it since he saw the wagon. And she felt something warm move through her, at the understanding that he had been afraid for her. That his being afraid for her was its own kind of language. Carver sent word this morning, Ethan said. The bank in Omaha confirmed the signatures. The federal case is solid. How long until Gerald's lawyers try to fight it? They already have, Ethan said. Carver said they filed a challenge yesterday. He also said the challenge has about as much chance as a paper bridge in a rainstorm. Direct quote. Clara felt the corner of her mouth pull. I like Carver. He said the same about you, Ethan said. She looked at him. He doesn't know me. He said anybody who walks into a federal marshal's office with that much documentation and that much composure is either a lawyer or someone who should have been one. He looked at her steadily. He also said the 12 pages from your father are the most thorough private account of financial fraud he's seen in 20 years of federal work. Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the east window, the glass she'd carried herself. The frame she'd built, the morning light that came through it, exactly the way she'd planned. My father was a school teacher, she said again, but this time it landed differently. Not as explanation as pride. He raised you, Ethan said. It was simple and complete, the way he said the things that mattered most. She looked at him. He was looking at her with that look. And this time she did not file it away or set it aside for later. This time she let it stay where it was, in the room with both of them, taking up the space it had been quietly asking to take up for weeks. Come inside, she said. See what the house looks like with the door closed. He looked at her. The side of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but the thing that lived right next to one. He came inside. The federal case took 6 weeks to resolve. 6 weeks during which Aldous Fitch resigned his position as land agent and left Harrow Creek for somewhere that was not discussed in polite company. 6 weeks during which the 2 witnesses who had recanted presented with the federal investigation and the specific language of obstruction of justice reversed their statements and reaffirmed their original signatures on the deed. 6 weeks during which Robert Kavanaugh came down from Lincoln by stage and sat in a federal hearing room in Laramie and placed his copies on the table and answered every question with the steadiness of a man who had kept his copies for 4 years precisely because he knew this day would come. Gerald Whitmore did not go to prison. His lawyers were too good for that. And the federal system moved with the particular slowness of systems that are thorough rather than fast. What happened instead was a civil judgment that unwound the mineral rights sale, returned the Nebraska land to the estate, and required Gerald to account for every borrowed dollar with interest. His lawyers called it a settlement. Carver called it the best available outcome given the timeline. Clara called it enough, because the deed to 40 Wyoming acres was confirmed. The disputed title notation was removed, and her father's name was on the right side of a federal record. It was enough. She went back to Harrow Creek on a Tuesday. The same stage stop where she had arrived 3 months earlier, with a deed in her pocket and a toolbox in her hand, and the specific terror of someone who has committed to a direction and is no longer sure what happens when you arrive. She stepped off the stage and looked down the main street of Harrow Creek, and it was the same town it had always been, the same buildings. The same dust, the same quality of light in the afternoon. It felt completely different, because she was different. Not changed, she was very specifically the same person who had arrived in June, with the same size and the same face and the same absolute refusal to be smaller than she was. But something had settled. Something had come home to itself. The person who had arrived in June had been running toward something she wasn't sure she'd get. The person who stood on this stage platform was standing on ground that was hers, that had been proven to be hers, that no one could take from her now. Roy Dunham was at the post office across the street. He saw her. He held his hat in his hands, turned it once, and nodded. She nodded back. She went home. The dinner happened on a Friday evening in September, when the Wyoming heat had finally broken and the evenings were cool enough to leave the door open, and the stars came out early and stayed. May arrived first, because May had inherited her father's directness and none of his restraint about showing excitement. And she had been talking about this dinner since Ethan had mentioned it was happening. She came through the door of Clara's house and stopped in the middle of the main room and turned in a slow circle, looking at everything: the east window, the shelves Clara had built along the north wall, the table and 2 chairs that she'd made herself from the leftover timber, the lamp on the table casting warm light across everything. You built all of this, May said. Most of it, Clara said. Your father built the shelf brackets. He said mine were going to hold for about a year before they gave out. He was right, May said, with the certainty of someone who had watched her father build things. He was right, Clara agreed. May looked at her. Are you going to marry my father? Clara looked at this 9-year-old girl Eleanor's eyes. Ethan's jaw, nobody else's particular way of going directly to the center of things, and she felt something that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob and landed somewhere in between. Warm and real and wholly unexpected, May, she said. I'm just asking, May said. I know you are, Clara said. Because if you are, May said, with the serious practicality of someone laying out a business proposal. Then I would come here for summers instead of going back to Cheyenne. And I could help you with the property, and Papa would stop looking like he's holding something heavy and not letting anyone help him with it. She paused. I think it would be good for everyone. Clara crouched down to May's level. She looked at this girl who had handed her nails for weeks and asked careful questions and leaned against her in the dark and who was, at 9 years old, the most honest person she had met in recent memory. May, she said, your father and I are figuring things out. But you like him, May said. Yes, Clara said, I like him, and he likes you, May said. He doesn't say it, but he looks at you the way he used to look at the mountains when he first came out here. Like he couldn't believe something that big was real, and also right there. Clara went very still. May looked at her with Eleanor's eyes. I just thought you should know, she said. Ethan came through the door at that moment. He had tied the horses and was brushing off his coat with the particular slightly self-conscious care of a man who does not usually think much about his coat but has thought about it today, and he looked at the two of them, crouched and standing, and said, What are we talking about? Nothing, May said. With exactly her father's tone, Ethan looked at Clara. Clara stood up and looked at him, and felt everything May had just said sit in the room with them. Warm and real and completely visible. Dinner's ready, she said. He looked at her for a long moment with the look that had a name now that she had let herself name. Fully, without setting aside. He stepped inside her house, and the door swung half shut behind him, and the lamp on the table lit the three of them in warm light. And he said, It smells good in here. It's home, Clara said. It smells like home. Yes, he said. Quiet does. Later, much later. After dinner, after May had fallen asleep on the spare cot that Clara had put in the back room, because she had known May was coming, and had known what that meant, Ethan and Clara sat on the south wall outside. The same wall she had sat on the first evening he'd ridden away. The evening she'd felt something close to hope. The Wyoming stars were very bright. The night was cool. From somewhere up on the ridge, Scout barked once and went quiet. Carver sent a final letter, Ethan said. The Nebraska judgment was entered yesterday. Gerald's appealing, but Carver says the appeal has no legs. Good, Clara said. Fitch's replacement starts next month. Younger man. Out of Cheyenne. Carver ran a background. Good, she said again. He was quiet for a moment. You're not going to ask about Gerald? No, she said. Gerald is Carver's concern now. I'm done spending my attention on Gerald Whitmore. She looked at the stars. My father spent 2 years watching what Gerald was doing and not being able to stop it. I spent 6 months fighting it. It's done. He doesn't get any more of my time. Ethan was quiet. That's very clear, he said. I'm a clear person, she said. You are, he said. He looked at her. Clara. She looked at him. He was close. They were sitting on a wall that was not very wide. The way they'd sat on it before in different circumstances, and he was looking at her with the look. Full and direct and done being careful about it. I told you on the road, he said. What I'm not saying. I told I wasn't going to take it back. I remember, she said. I need to say it, he said, out loud. So we're both clear. He turned toward her. His hands were on the wall between them. I love you, he said. I didn't plan to. I planned to live on that ridge until May was grown, and then figure out what came after, and never I didn't plan any of this. He looked at her with the absolute directness of a man who has spent his whole life saying things plainly, and has chosen to apply that skill to the hardest thing he's had to say in 4 years. But I love you, and I am not going anywhere, And if you need time to figure out what that means for you, I've got time, all of it. Clara looked at him. She thought about June. She thought about a log swinging wrong and hitting the dirt 6 inches from where she'd been standing. She thought about a man on a ridge who had watched her for 16 days and come down not because she fell, but because she kept getting up. She thought about hemp rope and a tin plate of biscuits and a 9-year-old girl handing nails with serious precision and a ride to Laramie before sunrise and a federal marshal and 12 pages of her father's careful handwriting that had, in the end, done exactly what he had written them to do. She thought about her father pressing his hands to her face and saying, "Go build something." My girl. She had built something. She reached out and put her hand over his on the wall. His hand turned and held hers, steady and certain. The same way he did everything. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. I love you too," she said. "I've known it for a while. I was just waiting until I had room to say it out loud." He looked at her. He squeezed her hand once hard, brief, the way you hold something you are not going to drop. "You've got room now," he said. "I've got a whole house," she said. "I built it myself." It was a real laugh. Low and full, the kind she hadn't heard from him before, the kind that had been waiting under all that careful quiet for something worth coming out for. It filled the Wyoming night and went up toward the stars, and Scout barked once on the ridge in response. And somewhere inside the house May slept, and the south wall held them both, the way it had always held, everything Clara had set against it solid. True, built to last. She had ridden into Harrow Creek in June as a woman everyone expected to fail. She had been too young and too alone, and too much of everything they'd decided a woman shouldn't be. And they had looked at her and seen a problem, and she had looked at this land and seen a home, and she had been right and they had been wrong. And every log she had dragged, and every nail she had driven, and every wall she had refused to stop building had proven it. She was not too much. She had never been too much. She was exactly enough for this land, for this house, for the man sitting beside her with his hand around hers, for the daughter sleeping inside, for everything her father had believed she was when he pressed his hands to her face in December and told her to go. She had gone. She had built it, it was hers, and she was never ever giving it back.